Alright, before we begin, take a moment. If you can, dim the lights a little. Set your phone down or rest it somewhere comfortable. Let your shoulders relax. There's nowhere you need to go right now. Nothing you need to do. Tonight, we're just drifting gently backward in time. This is a story meant to be listened to slowly. A story you don't have to remember perfectly. If your mind wanders, that's fine. If you fall asleep halfway through, that's even better. Now, let's begin. Long before history books, before marble statues and museum labels, the ancient Greeks tried to understand the world the same way people everywhere have always tried to understand it. They told stories. They looked at thunderstorms and imagined arguments in the sky. They saw the sea rise and fall and believed a god was breathing beneath it. They watched the sun crawl across the heavens each day and decided it must be guided by a divine hand. Greek mythology wasn't created all at once. It grew slowly over centuries, shaped by farmers, sailors, poets, and people sitting around fires late at night, much like this moment now. And every story, no matter how grand, starts at the beginning. Before there was earth, before there was sky, before there were gods with names and personalities, there was chaos. Not chaos in the modern sense of noise or disorder, but chaos as a vast, silent emptiness. A yawning gap where nothing had yet taken shape. From chaos emerged the first beings, quiet and elemental. Gaia, the earth, solid and patient. Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath everything. Eros, the force of attraction, the gentle pull that allowed creation to continue. Without ceremonies or announcements, existence simply unfolded. Gaia brought forth Uranus, the sky, who stretched himself above her like a great blue dome. Together, earth and sky became the first divine pair, and their union was constant, unbroken, almost suffocating. From them came children, many children. The Titans were born first. Huge, powerful beings tied to natural forces and cosmic principles. Oceanus, the endless river encircling the world. Hyperion, light itself. Mnemosyne, memory. Rhea, gentle yet strong. And Cronus, the youngest and the most ambitious. But Uranus feared his own children. Some of them were strange. Some were monstrous. And Uranus, rather than embracing them, forced them back into Gaia's depths, imprisoning them within the earth itself. Gaia suffered, and eventually she grew angry. She fashioned a sickle from flint and asked her children if any would stand against their father. Most were afraid. Only Cronus stepped forward. One night, as Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, Cronus struck. With one swift, brutal act, he overthrew his father, separating sky from earth forever. And just like that, the first divine regime fell. Cronus became king of the cosmos. At first, his rule seemed peaceful. This era would later be remembered as a kind of golden age. The world was young. Human suffering, as later generations would know it, hadn't fully arrived. Cronus ruled alongside his sister wife, Rhea. And like his parents before him, he began to have children. But here's where things get complicated. Cronus had heard a prophecy. A simple one. Chilling in its clarity. One of his children would overthrow him. So Cronus did what, unfortunately, many figures in Greek mythology do when faced with destiny. He tried to avoid it. Every time Rhea gave birth, Cronus was there. And every newborn god, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, was swallowed whole. Not harmed. Not killed. Just stored. Rhea was devastated. A mother watching her children disappear one by one. And when she became pregnant again, she decided this time would be different. When the sixth child was born, Rhea hid him away on the island of Crete. In his place, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Cronus. Cronus swallowed it without question. The hidden child was named Zeus. While his siblings remained trapped inside their father, Zeus grew up in secret. Nursed by a divine goat. Protected by warriors who clashed their shields to drown out his cries. And as Zeus grew, so did his awareness of what had been done. When the time came, Zeus returned. With cleverness rather than brute force, he gave Cronus a potion that forced him to disgorge what he had swallowed. Out came the stone. Then the gods, older now, angry, and very ready to reclaim their place. What followed was a war that lasted 10 long years. The Titanomachy. Olympians versus Titans. Children against parents. Sky shaking. Earth groaning. The Titans were powerful, but Zeus had allies. He freed the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants imprisoned long ago. In gratitude, they forged weapons for the gods. Thunderbolts for Zeus. A trident for Poseidon. A helm of invisibility for Hades. With these gifts, the tide turned. In the end, Zeus and his siblings emerged victorious. The Titans were cast into Tartarus, bound and guarded. A new order had begun. Zeus divided the cosmos with his brothers. Poseidon received the sea, Hades the underworld, and Zeus took the sky. Mount Olympus became the home of the gods. Not a place of constant peace, but one of endless stories. And quietly, without ceremony, the age of the Olympians began. Now, take a slow breath. We've reached the dawn of the gods most people recognize. But this is only the beginning. In the next stretch of our story, we'll gently wander through Mount Olympus itself, meeting the gods not as distant symbols, but as deeply flawed, oddly human personalities with divine power and very recognizable problems that if your eyes are still open, you can let them close now. If they're already closed, that's perfect. The world outside can wait. We're returning to Mount Olympus. Not the postcard version with perfect marble columns and glowing sunsets, but the lived-in Olympus. A place full of arguments, laughter, jealousy, and the occasional thunderbolt thrown in a bad mood. Because the Greek gods, for all their power, were never calm beings. They were dramatic, sensitive, often petty, and very, very human. At the center of it all sat Zeus, king of the gods, lord of the sky, controller of lightning, and, if we're being honest, a walking lesson in what absolute power does to self-control. Zeus ruled from a golden throne, but ruling never meant peace. He was strong, decisive, and feared, but also impulsive. His temper could ignite storms. His affection could complicate entire family trees. By his side sat Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, protector of family. Hera believed deeply in loyalty, which made her marriage to Zeus especially painful, because Zeus, despite being married, rarely behaved like it. Time and again Zeus fell in love, or lust, with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women alike. And while Zeus's affairs were frequent, the consequences almost always landed on someone else, usually Hera. Hera's anger was legendary. Not loud and explosive like Zeus's lightning, but slow, deliberate, and relentless. She rarely punished Zeus directly. Instead, she targeted the results of his betrayals. Children, mistresses, entire bloodlines. One of Zeus's many children was Athena. But Athena's birth was unusual. Zeus had been warned that his lover Métis would bear a child more powerful than him. So Zeus swallowed Métis whole, an old family strategy apparently. Sometime later, Zeus developed a splitting headache, the kind no thunderbolt could fix. Hephaestus cracked Zeus's skull open with an axe. And out stepped Athena, fully grown, fully armored, calm, focused. Athena became the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and clever warfare. Not the chaos of battle, but the planning behind it. She was thoughtful, disciplined, and unusually restrained for an Olympian. In many ways, Athena was the version of Zeus he wished he was. Then there was Ares, the god of war. Not wisdom, not planning, just bloodshed, rage, and noise. Ares loved battle for its own sake. The screams, the clash of metal, the rush. Other gods tolerated him. Very few admired him. Athena in particular despised Ares. To her, war was tragic but sometimes necessary. To Ares it was entertainment. And then came Apollo. Golden, graceful Apollo. God of the sun, music, prophecy, poetry, and healing. Apollo represented balance, order, harmony. He played the lyre. He guided the sun across the sky. He spoke through oracles, whispering fate in riddles that never quite made sense until it was too late. Apollo had a twin sister, Artemis, goddess of the moon, of the hunt, of wild places untouched by civilization. Where Apollo loved crowds and praise, Artemis preferred solitude. She ran through forests with her bow. She guarded young women and demanded independence. No husband, no compromises. Together, the twins balanced light and dark, sun and moon, reason and instinct. Down in the forge, far from Olympus's polished halls, worked Hephaestus, god of fire, god of craftsmanship. The only Olympian often described as physically imperfect. Hephaestus was lame, thrown from Olympus as a child, by Hera in some versions, because he didn't meet her standards of perfection. Yet Hephaestus built wonders. Weapons no one else could forge. Jewelry that moved on its own. Thrones that trapped their occupants. He built Olympus itself. And for all his skill, his personal life was complicated. He was married to Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty incarnate. Aphrodite had risen from the sea foam itself, born from violence and beauty intertwined. Where she walked, desire followed. And Aphrodite, unsurprisingly, did not remain faithful to Hephaestus. She fell in love with Ares, which, considering their personalities, was less surprising romance and more inevitable disaster. Hephaestus eventually trapped them in a net of unbreakable metal and exposed them to the other gods. The gods laughed, which tells you quite a lot about Olympus. Then there was Hermes, messenger of the gods, god of travelers, thieves, and clever lies. Hermes moved fast, thought faster. He could steal cattle as a newborn and talk his way out of punishment before lunch. He guided souls to the underworld, delivered messages between realms, and always seemed to be halfway through a joke no one else quite understood. Speaking of the underworld, Hades ruled there. Not evil, not cruel, just distant. Hades governed the realm of the dead with strict fairness. No favors, no escapes. He rarely left his kingdom, which suited him just fine. His most famous story involved Persephone. One day, Persephone was gathering flowers when the ground opened beneath her. Hades emerged and carried her away to the underworld. Her mother, Demeter, goddess of agriculture, searched endlessly. In her grief, crops failed. The earth grew barren. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and part of the year on earth with her mother. Thus the seasons were born. Winter, spring, loss and return. And quietly, beneath all these divine dramas, humanity watched. Humans were small, fragile, short-lived, but the gods were endlessly fascinated by them. Humans prayed, suffered, loved, and sometimes, against all odds, defied the gods themselves. And that's where our story will drift next. Heroes. Mortals who stood between gods and monsters. People whose lives burned briefly, but brightly enough to echo through eternity that if you need to shift your pillow or settle deeper into your chair, do it slowly. There's no rush here. The gods can wait. Now, as the Olympians argued and loved and schemed above, something new was happening below. Mortals began to matter. Not just as worshippers, not just as background characters, but as central figures in stories the gods themselves couldn't ignore. This was the age of heroes. Heroes weren't perfect. They weren't calm. And they certainly weren't immortal. They were human beings, often stubborn, emotional, and deeply flawed, who found themselves caught between divine expectations and mortal limits. One of the earliest heroes was Perseus. Perseus didn't start out strong or famous. In fact, his life began with a problem. A prophecy. King Acrisius of Argos had been told that his grandson would kill him. So when his daughter Danae gave birth to Perseus, Acrisius panicked. He didn't kill them outright. That might anger the gods. Instead, he placed Danae and baby Perseus into a wooden chest and set them adrift at sea, which, in Greek mythology, is usually code for, the gods are about to intervene. The chest washed ashore on a distant island. They survived. Perseus grew up strong, kind, and unaware of the prophecy hanging over his life, until one day he was challenged to prove himself. He was sent to kill Medusa. Medusa, once a beautiful woman, had been transformed into a monster. Snakes for hair. A gaze that turned anyone who met it into stone. No ordinary man could face her. But Perseus wasn't alone. The gods helped, though not out of pure kindness. Athena gave him a polished shield. Hermes gave him winged sandals. Hades lent him a helm of invisibility. Perseus approached Medusa without looking directly at her. Using the reflection in his shield, he struck. One clean motion. And with Medusa defeated, Perseus didn't just survive. He became a legend. Along the way, he rescued Andromeda, a princess chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. Another prophecy avoided. Another life altered. Eventually, Perseus did fulfill the prophecy, accidentally. Years later, during a sporting event, he threw a discus that struck and killed Acrisius. Fate, it seemed, was patient. Then there was Heracles, or Hercules as the Romans later called him. If Perseus was clever, Heracles was raw strength. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, which made Hera furious. From the moment Heracles was born, Hera sought to destroy him. She sent snakes to his cradle. The baby strangled them. As an adult, Heracles was powerful beyond measure. But his life was never peaceful. Driven mad by Hera's influence, he committed an unforgivable act, killing his own family. When sanity returned, guilt crushed him. To atone, he was given a task. Actually, 12 tasks. The 12 labors of Heracles, each one impossible. He killed the Nemean lion, whose skin no weapon could pierce. He defeated the Hydra, whose heads multiplied when cut. He cleaned the Augean stables, by redirecting a river. He captured wild beasts, stole sacred objects, traveled to the underworld and returned. Labor by labor, Heracles proved something important. Strength alone wasn't enough. Endurance mattered more. In the end, even Heracles couldn't escape pain. He died in agony, but was granted immortality afterward. A mortal who earned a place among the gods. Then came Theseus, Prince of Athens, hero with a quiet confidence. Theseus is remembered for the labyrinth. Deep beneath the island of Crete, a monster waited, the Minotaur, half man, half bull. A creature born from betrayal, trapped inside a maze so complex no one could escape once inside. Each year, young Athenians were sent as sacrifices. Theseus volunteered. Before entering the labyrinth, he was given a simple gift, a ball of thread. Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, gave it to him. Theseus, she said, tie one end to the entrance. Follow it back. Inside the labyrinth, Theseus found the Minotaur. The battle was brutal, close, personal. Theseus won, and the thread guided him home. Sometimes, Greek myths remind us that intelligence is quieter than strength, but just as powerful. And then there was the greatest hero of them all, Odysseus. Odysseus wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't even the bravest. But he was clever. Very clever. When the Greeks fought the Trojan War, a decade-long conflict sparked by love, pride, and divine manipulation, it was Odysseus who ended it. Not with swords. With a lie. The Trojan horse. A wooden gift left at the gates. Greek soldiers hidden inside. The city fell while it slept. But victory didn't mean peace. Odysseus's journey home took 10 years. 10 years of storms, monsters, temptations, and loss. He faced the Cyclops Polyphemus. Escaped sirens whose songs lured sailors to their deaths. Survived the witch Circe. Traveled to the underworld. All while longing for home. For his wife, Penelope. For his son, Telemachus. And while Odysseus wandered, Penelope waited. Surrounded by suitors. Pressured to move on. She delayed them with patience and intelligence, unraveling by night what she wove by day. In the end, Odysseus returned disguised as a beggar. Only Penelope truly recognized him. And when the truth was revealed, balance was restored. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were lessons. About pride. About patience. About the cost of anger, and the quiet strength of loyalty. The heroes were never perfect. But they were human. And through them, the Greeks explored what it meant to struggle, to fail, and to keep going anyway. Now, let the heroes rest. In the next part, we'll drift into the quieter myths. The strange ones. The stories about fate, punishment, transformation, and the thin line between mortal and divine. Let your breathing slow. Nothing here needs urgency. Greek mythology has waited thousands of years. It can wait a little longer for us. As the great heroes faded into legend, the stories themselves began to change tone. Less about battles. Less about conquest. More about consequences. Because one of the quiet truths of Greek mythology is this. The gods didn't just reward courage. They punished mistakes. And sometimes, they punished curiosity. One of the most well-known stories is also one of the simplest. Pandora. Before Pandora, humanity lived without disease, suffering, or despair. Life wasn't perfect, but it was lighter. The gods decided humans needed a reminder of limits. So Zeus ordered the creation of Pandora, the first woman. She was given beauty by Aphrodite, charm by Hermes, grace by Athena, and curiosity. Pandora was given a sealed container, often called a box, though it was more likely a jar. Never open this, she was told, which, in mythology, is essentially an invitation. For a while she resisted. But curiosity has a quiet voice. It whispers. It doesn't shout. Eventually, Pandora opened the container. Out poured sickness, fear, jealousy, pain, grief. Everything that makes life difficult rushed into the world. Pandora slammed the lid shut just in time to trap one final thing inside. Hope. And so, even in suffering, something gentle remained. Another quiet story is that of Icarus. A young man with wings made of feathers and wax. His father, deadless, built them to escape imprisonment. Before flight, he warned his son. Don't fly too low, the sea will dampen your wings. And don't fly too high, the sun will melt them. At first, Icarus listened. But flying felt incredible. The sky was open. The air was free. He climbed higher. Higher still. Until the sun softened the wax. The wings failed. Icarus fell. The lesson wasn't about ambition being wrong. It was about balance. Greek myths often remind us. Too much of anything, even freedom, can be dangerous. Then there was Narcissus. A beautiful young man who rejected everyone who loved him. He wasn't cruel. Just uninterested. One day he leaned over a pool of water and saw his reflection. and fell in love. He stayed there, gazing endlessly, unable to look away. Eventually he faded. In his place grew a flower, the narcissus, a quiet warning about self-obsession, wrapped in a gentle image. Transformation was a common theme. Daphne, pursued by Apollo, begged to escape him, and became a laurel tree. Arachne challenged Athena to a weaving contest and was turned into a spider. Actaeon glimpsed Artemis bathing and became a stag, hunted by his own hounds. These weren't just punishments, they were explanations. Why spiders weave, why laurel crowns exist, why certain things feel sacred. Mythology gave meaning to the everyday. Even love stories weren't simple. Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the quietest, saddest myths of all. Orpheus could charm anything with his music. Trees leaned in to listen. Stones softened. When Eurydice died, Orpheus traveled to the underworld to retrieve her. Hades listened. Persephone listened. They agreed on one condition. Orpheus must walk ahead and not look back until they reached the surface. He walked, step by step. Just before daylight, doubt crept in. Was she really there? He turned, and she was gone. Forever. The myth doesn't shout its lesson. It whispers it. Trust is fragile, and sometimes fear ruins what love nearly saves. As time passed, these stories became quieter, more reflective. They weren't about defeating monsters anymore. They were about understanding limits, fate, hubris, change. And slowly, almost unnoticed, the gods themselves began to feel distant. Worship continued. Temples stood. But people changed. Philosophy emerged. History replaced legend. Reason began asking questions myth couldn't answer. Greek mythology didn't disappear. It settled into language, into art, into how we describe pride, curiosity, beauty, tragedy. Even now you hear it. A Herculean task, an Achilles' heel, a Sisyphean effort. The stories never left. They just learned how to whisper instead of shout. So as this part of our journey comes to rest, let your thoughts drift. The gods have spoken. The heroes have faded. The lessons remain. And when you're ready, we'll continue, moving gently toward how these myths shaped the world long after belief itself began to sleep. If you've stayed with me this long, you're doing exactly what this story was meant for. No pressure to remember names. No need to follow every detail perfectly. Just let the words drift by like slow waves. By now the gods feel familiar. The heroes feel distant. And the myths themselves have begun to soften. This is where Greek mythology changes shape once again. Because not every story was about glory or punishment. Some were about effort without reward. About endurance without victory. About living with problems that never truly go away. The Greeks were very good at noticing those kinds of problems. And no myth captures this better than the story of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a king. Clever. Too clever. He cheated death more than once. Outsmarted gods. Bent rules. The gods, unsurprisingly, did not appreciate this. So when Sisyphus finally died for good, he was given a special punishment. He was sent to the underworld and tasked with rolling a massive stone up a hill. Every time he reached the top, the stone rolled back down. Again. And again. And again. Forever. No dramatic suffering. No screaming. Just endless repetition. The Greeks understood something modern people still feel deeply. Some struggles don't end. Some work never stays done. And yet, Sisyphus keeps pushing. Another quiet figure is Tantalus. A man who offended the gods in ways too disturbing to repeat calmly. His punishment was subtle. He was placed in a pool of water beneath fruit trees. Whenever he reached for water, it receded. Whenever he reached for fruit, the branches lifted away. Endless desire. Endless frustration. From him we get the word tantalize. Always close. Never satisfied. Then there were the Fates. 3 quiet figures who rarely spoke but controlled everything. Clotho spun the thread of life. Lachesis measured it. Atropos cut it. Even Zeus respected them. Which tells you something important. In Greek mythology, not even the gods were fully in control. Fate existed above power. This idea comforted people. And frightened them. Because it meant suffering wasn't always personal. Sometimes it was simply woven. Dreams also mattered. Morpheus, god of dreams, shaped visions in sleep. Sending messages. Warnings. Illusions. Sleep itself was sacred. Hypnos, the god of sleep, lived in a quiet cave where no light reached. Even Zeus respected his domain. Perhaps that's why these stories still work so well at night. They were meant to be told slowly, softly. The Greeks believed memory lived in the underworld too. The river Lethe caused forgetfulness. Souls drank from it before rebirth. To forget pain. To forget regret. Sometimes forgetting was mercy. And sometimes remembering was the punishment. That was the fate of Cassandra. Granted the gift of prophecy. Cursed so no one would believe her. She saw disasters coming. She warned everyone. And was ignored. A cruel irony. A familiar one. As centuries passed, these myths stopped being religion and became reflection. Philosophers like Plato referenced them. Artists reshaped them. Poets softened them. They weren't instructions anymore. They were mirrors, showing humans their fears, their hopes, their patterns. And that's why Greek mythology never really ended. It adapted. Rome adopted the gods under new names. Renaissance artists painted them. Modern psychology borrowed their symbols. Even now, when someone says they're fighting their demons, or tempted by the siren call, or stuck pushing the same boulder every day, they're still telling Greek myths, just quietly. So as we let part 5 drift to a close, notice how calm these stories have become. No battles, no monsters, just meaning. In the next part, we'll gently explore how Greek mythology crossed into real history, how gods faded into allegory, and stories learned to survive without belief. That if you've adjusted your position a dozen times by now, that's perfectly fine. Stories like this are meant to move with you, not hold you still. By this point, the gods no longer feel loud. They don't throw thunderbolts as often. They don't shout from the clouds. They've begun to fade into something gentler. And that's exactly what happened in the real world. As centuries passed, the ancient Greeks began to change how they understood their myths. The story stayed, but belief softened. People still told tales of Zeus and Athena, but they also began asking questions. Why does the world work the way it does? What is justice? What makes a good life? Philosophers appeared. They didn't deny the myths outright. They reinterpreted them. Plato spoke of ideal forms but still referenced the gods. Aristotle looked for causes and logic, yet lived in a world filled with temples. Myth and reason coexisted quietly. The gods became symbols. Athena wasn't just a goddess anymore. She represented wisdom itself. Ares became blind violence. Apollo became balance and order. Stories once taken literally became lessons. And as Greek culture spread, so did its myths. When Rome rose to power, it didn't erase Greek mythology. It borrowed it. Zeus became Jupiter. Hera became Juno. Ares became Mars. Aphrodite became Venus. The personalities stayed mostly the same. The names changed, which tells you something important. The Romans didn't just conquer land. They adopted stories. And then, slowly, belief shifted again. New religions appeared. Christianity spread. Temples closed. Oracles fell silent. But the myths didn't vanish. They moved into libraries, into art, into the background of culture. In the Middle Ages, Greek myths survived through copies of old texts. Monks preserved them, not as sacred stories but as knowledge. During the Renaissance, they exploded back into life. Painters filled canvases with gods and nymphs. Sculptors carved heroes in marble. Poets revived old tales with new emotion. The gods returned, not as rulers but as inspiration. And in modern times, mythology found yet another form. Psychology. Carl Jung spoke of archetypes: the hero, the shadow, the trickster. All of them lived in Greek myths. The hero's journey. The descent into darkness. The return changed. These patterns repeat because humans repeat. Even today, Greek mythology lives on. In movies, in books, in names. Nike, Atlas, Amazon. You don't have to believe in Zeus to feel the weight of the sky. And maybe that's the quiet beauty of these stories. They don't demand belief. They offer understanding. As this part of the story gently settles, notice how far we've drifted. From chaos to gods. From gods to heroes. From heroes to lessons. From lessons to culture. Greek mythology didn't end. It transformed. And in the next part, we'll slow down even more, looking at the smaller, softer myths that often get overlooked, but say just as much about being human. If your breathing has slowed, let it slow a little more. These stories don't mind being told at night. They were born for moments like this. By now, Greek mythology feels less like a grand saga and more like a quiet landscape. Not towering mountains anymore, gentle hills. Not crashing storms, soft weather. This part of the story lives in the smaller myths. The ones that rarely get statues. The ones without epic battles or famous heroes. But they matter just as much, because they speak about ordinary emotions. Fear, loneliness, longing, time. Let's start with Echo. Echo was a nymph. Bright, talkative. Too talkative. She once distracted Hera with endless chatter, allowing Zeus to escape one of his many affairs. Hera, unsurprisingly, noticed. As punishment, Echo lost her own voice. She could only repeat the last words spoken to her. Later, Echo fell in love with Narcissus, but she couldn't express herself. Rejected and unable to speak, she faded away, until only her voice remained. An echo. A story about losing your words. About being present but unheard. Then there's Selene, goddess of the moon. Every night, she crossed the sky in quiet solitude. She fell in love with Endymion, a mortal man. Rather than let him age and die, Selene placed him into eternal sleep. She visited him each night. A love that never argued, never changed, never truly lived. Beautiful and sad. Time itself was personified. Chronos, not the Titan Cronus, but time as an idea. Always moving, always consuming. The Greeks understood time not as an enemy, but as a current. You could swim with it, or fight it. Either way it flowed on. There were household spirits too. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, rarely appears in dramatic stories. But she was everywhere. In fire, in warmth, in shared meals. She represented stability. In a pantheon full of chaos, Hestia chose stillness. She gave up power for peace. And then there's Pan. Half man, half goat. God of wild places. Pan wasn't civilized. He startled travelers with sudden fear, what we now call panic. Yet Pan also played music that echoed through valleys. He represented the untamed parts of nature. The parts humans both fear and miss. As cities grew, Pan faded. But the wilderness never did. The Greeks also told stories about friendship. Castor and Pollux, twin brothers. One mortal, one divine. When Castor died, Pollux begged Zeus to let them stay together. So Zeus split their existence. Part of the year in the underworld. Part in the sky as the constellation Gemini. A story about loyalty that even death couldn't separate. And then there were the Muses. 9 goddesses of inspiration. They didn't create art. They sparked it. Poets waited for them. Artists prayed to them. Because creativity, like myth, can't be forced. It arrives when it's ready. These quieter myths didn't try to explain the universe. They explained feelings. Why silence hurts. Why time slips away. Why comfort matters. Why nature calls. And perhaps that's why they still linger. As this part drifts toward rest, notice how gentle everything has become. No wars. No punishments. Just stories about being human in a world that keeps moving. In the next part, we'll begin the long, slow closing of the mythic age, watching how these stories gently step aside and make room for history, memory, and modern imagination. That if your body feels heavier now, that's a good sign. Stories like this aren't meant to be followed closely, they're meant to carry you. By this point in our journey, Greek mythology feels distant in time, but close in spirit. The gods are no longer loud voices in the sky. They've become quiet presences, like old memories that surface unexpectedly. This is where the myths begin to step back. Not abruptly, not dramatically. They fade the way evening fades into night. As cities grew larger and societies more complex, people began to rely less on myth to explain storms or seasons. They built calendars. They studied stars. They recorded history. And yet, even as belief softened, ritual remained. Festivals continued. Stories were retold at gatherings. Children learned the names of gods long after temples stopped filling. Myth became tradition. And tradition has a way of lasting. Greek theater played a role in this transition. Tragedies retold old myths, but with a new focus. Not on divine power, but on human choice. Playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides asked difficult questions. Is fate unavoidable? Or do our decisions shape it? Characters like Oedipus struggled against prophecy only to fulfill it. Not because the gods forced him, but because he acted without full understanding. These plays weren't about worship. They were about reflection. And audiences recognized themselves in the characters. Even the gods on stage felt smaller, more distant, more symbolic. As centuries passed, storytellers stopped adding new myths. No new gods appeared. No new epics emerged. The mythic age had ended. But memory remained. The Greeks believed memory itself was sacred. Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, was the mother of the Muses. Without memory, creativity couldn't exist. So remembering these stories became an act of preservation. Later civilizations understood this. The Romans wrote them down. Arab scholars preserved Greek texts during Europe's darkest centuries. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered them. Every generation found something new in old myths. Power, wealth, fear. Loss. The stories adapted because humans did. Even now, when someone talks about tempting fate or defying the gods, they're speaking a language shaped by ancient stories. And that's the quiet magic of mythology. It doesn't demand belief. It offers vocabulary. As this part eases toward its end, notice how peaceful the myths feel now. They're no longer commands. They're companions. In the next part, we'll gently explore how Greek mythology continues to live, not in temples or prayers, but in modern stories, art, and the quiet moments when old symbols still speak. That if you've drifted in and out a little, that's exactly right. Greek mythology doesn't mind being half-heard. It has always lived comfortably in the space between waking and sleep. By now, the gods are no longer figures of belief. They're echoes. And echoes, as you know, don't disappear. They soften. They repeat quietly in unexpected places. This is where Greek mythology settles into the modern world. Not loudly. Not demanding attention. Just present. Think about stories today. The heroes who leave home, face trials, descend into darkness, and return changed. That pattern is ancient. It's Odysseus sailing home. It's Orpheus walking out of the underworld. It's Persephone rising each spring. Modern stories didn't invent these paths. They inherited them. Even our idea of a flawed hero comes from Greece. Achilles was nearly invincible, but not entirely. His strength carried a weakness. And that idea stuck. Every superhero has one now. Every great character does. Greek mythology taught us that perfection is boring. What matters is struggle. The gods themselves weren't perfect. They argued. They made mistakes. They regretted decisions. In a strange way that made them comforting. They weren't distant ideals. They were exaggerated reflections. And as belief faded, psychology stepped in. Sigmund Freud named the Oedipus complex after a Greek tragedy. Carl Jung spoke of archetypes straight out of myth. The hero, the trickster, the shadow. Hermes lives in every clever rule breaker. Athena lives in every quiet strategist. Dionysus lives in celebration and excess. These figures didn't vanish. They moved inward. Myths stopped explaining the universe and started explaining us. Art carried them forward too. Paintings of Venus still hang in museums. Statues of Apollo still represent beauty. Nike still symbolizes victory, even if it's printed on a shoe. The names changed context, not meaning. And language itself kept the myths alive. We call someone narcissistic. We speak of a Herculean effort. We say a task is Sisyphean. We don't pause to explain why. The stories are already understood. And perhaps the most interesting thing about Greek mythology is this. It never insists. It doesn't threaten punishment for disbelief. It doesn't promise salvation. It simply tells stories. And stories, when told well, survive everything. Even silence. As the world grew louder, faster, more technological, these ancient myths became oddly calming. They remind us that humans have always worried, always hoped, always searched for meaning, that nothing we feel is new. Someone once blamed it on a god. Now we blame it on circumstance. But the feeling is the same. So as this part gently comes to rest, notice how familiar everything feels. The names may be old, the settings distant, but the emotions are yours. In the next part, we'll slow even further, moving toward the very end of the mythic journey, where stories stop being told and simply become background music to human life. If your thoughts feel soft around the edges now, that's exactly where they should be. This part of the story doesn't rush. It simply drifts. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, something gentle has happened. The gods have stopped acting. They've stopped interfering. They've stopped demanding attention. They've become background. And background, strangely enough, is where they last the longest. In the ancient world, people eventually stopped asking the gods why things happened. They started asking how. How does rain form? How do stars move? How does the body work? These questions didn't erase mythology. They quietly stood beside it. A fisherman might still pray to Poseidon before sailing, then study the wind and waves with equal seriousness. Faith and observation lived together. But as centuries passed, observation grew stronger. Maps replaced myths of sea monsters. Astronomy replaced stories of gods dragging the sun across the sky. Yet something curious remained. When humans explained the world logically, they still needed stories to explain themselves. Why do we repeat mistakes? Why does power corrupt? Why does love hurt? Science couldn't answer those questions. Mythology could. And so the gods retreated, not defeated but transformed. They moved into metaphor. Zeus became authority. Hera became resentment. Athena became clarity. Dionysus became escape. People no longer feared the gods' punishment, but they recognized the patterns. Too much pride still led to downfall. Too much desire still caused suffering. Ignoring balance still ended badly. The Greeks had warned us long ago, and quietly, they were right. There's a reason Greek myths are often told at night. They don't demand focus. They don't insist on belief. They unfold slowly, like dreams. Dreams don't explain themselves either. They offer images, feelings, moments. Greek mythology works the same way. You don't need to remember every name. You don't need to trace every family tree. You just need to recognize the feeling. The sense that humans have always stood somewhere between control and chaos, between knowledge and mystery, between light and darkness. And maybe that's why these stories remain comforting. They don't promise solutions. They promise understanding. As this part comes to a gentle pause, let the myths settle into the background of your thoughts. Like distant stars. Like old music you don't quite remember learning, but know by heart. In the next part, we'll begin the final long descent, where mythology no longer speaks directly, but continues to influence the world quietly, invisibly through memory, art, and the stories we still tell ourselves. By this point, the story isn't something you're following. It's something you're floating in. Greek mythology has reached its quietest phase. Not an ending, just a long exhale. The ancient Greeks never imagined their myths would end. They assumed stories worked the way seasons do. They return. They change shape. They soften. When belief faded, remembrance took its place. Parents still told children about clever Odysseus. Artists still painted Aphrodite rising from the sea. Poets still borrowed Apollo's light. The gods became cultural ancestors rather than divine rulers. And that shift made them strangely immortal. Because belief can disappear. Stories rarely do. As the modern world formed, Greek mythology slipped into education. Students learned the myths not as truth, but as foundation. These stories explained where ideas came from. Democracy was debated in Athens beneath statues of Athena. Logic was born in a culture already fluent in metaphor. Even the idea of tragedy, of inevitable loss, came from Greek storytelling. Nothing was wasted. Even failure mattered. Greek myths never promised happy endings. They promised meaning. Achilles knew he would die young, and chose glory anyway. Orpheus nearly succeeded, and that almost mattered more than success. Sisyphus never finished, but he endured. The Greeks understood something modern culture often forgets. A life doesn't need resolution to have value. It needs engagement. That's why these myths age so well. They don't argue with you. They don't instruct you. They sit beside you. When life feels unfair, there's a myth for that. When ambition burns too hot, there's a myth for that. When love is beautiful and painful at the same time, there's definitely a myth for that. And because of that, Greek mythology quietly trained humanity how to think in symbols. How to speak indirectly about difficult things. Instead of saying power corrupts, they told a story about Zeus. Instead of saying grief freezes the world, they told a story about Demeter. Instead of saying time takes everything, they told a story about Kronos. These stories didn't shout truth. They let truth approach slowly. And maybe that's why they're so well suited for the night. When the world is quiet, stories don't need to compete. They don't need spectacle. They can just be. As this part begins to settle, notice how little effort it takes now to stay with the story. That's not because it's simpler. It's because it's familiar. Greek mythology didn't survive by staying extraordinary. It survived by becoming ordinary. A shared reference. A quiet language. A set of images we all recognize, even if we don't know why. In the next part, we'll move even further outward, watching these myths dissolve almost completely into modern thought, until only their outlines remain. If you've been drifting in and out of sleep, that's exactly how this part likes to be heard. This is where the story becomes almost weightless. By now, Greek mythology no longer feels like a collection of tales. It feels like a quiet atmosphere. Something that surrounds thought rather than demanding attention. This is where myths stop being stories you hear, and start being ideas you recognize. In the modern world, most people never consciously think about Greek gods. Yet their influence moves quietly through everyday life. Justice is still imagined as balanced scales. Wisdom still wears a calm face. Love is still pictured as sudden, overwhelming, and slightly dangerous. These images didn't come from nowhere. They came from myth. Greek mythology taught humans how to picture abstract ideas. How to give shape to things that can't be touched. Fear became a monster. Time became an old god. Fate became a thread. Once you do that, ideas become easier to live with. You can't fight fear, but you can fight a monster. You can't stop time, but you can respect it. You can't escape fate, but you can walk toward it with dignity. The Greeks didn't invent these feelings. They invented ways to talk about them. And that's why mythology survived even after belief faded. Was useful. Even now, when someone feels trapped by routine, they don't say, "I'm experiencing existential repetition." They say, "I feel like Sisyphus." One sentence, 1,000 years of meaning. Myths became shorthand for experience. They allowed people to communicate depth quickly, quietly, without explanation. And slowly, mythology merged with imagination itself. Writers borrowed freely. Filmmakers retold ancient arcs in new clothes. Games, novels, and songs echoed old patterns without naming them. A hero leaves home, faces temptation, descends into darkness, returns changed. It's ancient. It's comforting. Because it tells us that confusion has always been part of being human. Greek mythology never promised certainty. It promised company. You weren't alone in your fear. Others had faced it, long ago, and left behind a story. As belief systems rose and fell, myths remained flexible. They didn't demand loyalty. They adapted. That adaptability is their quiet strength. Rigid ideas break. Stories bend. As this part begins to drift toward its end, notice how gentle everything feels now. No conflicts. No divine punishments. No heroes striving. Just memory. Just meaning. In the next part, we'll move toward the very edge of the mythic world, where stories fade so completely into modern life that we stop noticing them at all. Take a slow breath. You don't need to listen closely anymore. Just let the sound exist. By the time we reach this part of the story, Greek mythology has almost completely dissolved into the background of human life. The gods no longer stand on mountains. They don't argue in thunder. They don't interfere in battles. They have become something quieter. They have become atmosphere. In the ancient world, stories were once answers. Why did the crops fail? Why did storms destroy ships? Why did people suffer? The answer was simple. A god did it. But as centuries moved forward, people learned new answers. Wind followed patterns. Stars followed rules. Illness had causes. And slowly, without anger, mythology stepped aside. But here is the strange part. Even when the answers changed, the stories stayed. Because mythology was never really about storms or crops. It was about uncertainty. And uncertainty never disappears. Even now, people still look at the night sky and feel small. Still feel wonder. Still feel fear. Science explains the stars. But it doesn't remove the feeling. Greek mythology understood that feeling perfectly. That's why the gods didn't vanish. They retreated into metaphor. When someone speaks of wrestling with fate, they are not being scientific. They are being mythic. When someone says, "Power went to his head," they are describing Zeus without knowing it. These old stories became tools for thought. Quiet tools. They allowed humans to think about things too large to face directly. Time. Meaning. Loss. The Greeks never tried to eliminate these fears. They sat with them. They told stories about them. And then they passed those stories forward. As generations changed, the names faded. But the shapes remained. The proud ruler who falls. The clever survivor who endures. The innocent who suffers. The wanderer who longs for home. You've seen these figures 1,000 times. In books. In films. In your own thoughts late at night. Greek mythology taught humanity that repetition isn't failure. It's pattern. And patterns are comforting. Because if something has happened before, it means it can be understood. As this segment slowly comes to rest, there's nothing to remember. No lesson to hold. Just the quiet understanding that stories don't need belief to survive, that there's nothing you need to follow closely anymore. If a sentence drifts past you, let it go. Another one will arrive. By this stage of the journey, Greek mythology feels less like history and more like a distant hum. Not words. Not images. Just a presence. This is where stories stop being told out loud and start living quietly inside people. Long after the last temple fell into ruin, long after sacrifices stopped and prayers changed shape, the myths continued in a different way. They became habits of thought. When the ancient Greeks imagined the gods, they weren't trying to build a religion that demanded obedience. They were trying to understand life without pretending it was simple. Their gods argued because people argue. Their gods failed because people fail. Their gods loved badly, ruled poorly, and made mistakes with permanent consequences. In that way, Greek mythology was never optimistic. But it was honest, and honesty lasts longer than certainty. As societies changed, people stopped saying, "Zeus is angry," and started saying, "Power always creates conflict." The meaning stayed. Only the language changed. This is how myths survive the longest. By becoming invisible. Think about how often ancient stories guide modern behavior without being named. People still admire cleverness over brute strength. That's Odysseus. People still fear unchecked ambition. That's Icarus. People still struggle with routines that never seem to end. That's Sisyphus. None of these ideas feel old. Because human nature isn't new. Greek mythology didn't predict the future. It observed the present very carefully. That's why these stories still feel accurate. Even now, late at night, when thoughts slow down, people ask the same quiet questions the Greeks once did. Why does effort not always lead to reward? Why do good intentions fail? Why does love bring both comfort and pain? The myths never answered these questions directly. They offered stories instead. Stories allow space. They don't corner you with conclusions. They let you sit with uncertainty without panic. And that's why Greek mythology fits so well into moments of rest. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't insist on solutions. It simply says, this has happened before. You're not alone. As this segment drifts toward its end, notice how little effort it takes now to remain with the story. That's not because the story is ending. It's because it has blended into the background, exactly where it has always belonged. Take a slow breath. There's nothing to solve here. Nothing to finish. Only a story that knows how to wait. By the time Greek mythology reaches this stage, it has fully accepted something humans often resist. Nothing lasts forever. Not gods. Not empires. Not even stories in their original form. And yet, something always remains. The ancient Greeks understood impermanence deeply. They saw cities rise and fall. They watched rulers come and go. They knew that even the strongest walls eventually cracked. So they didn't build myths around permanence. They built them around cycles. Day and night. Life and death. Loss and return. Persephone leaves, Persephone comes back. The crops fail, the crops grow again. The hero departs, the hero returns changed. Endings were never final. They were pauses. This way of thinking softened fear. If winter comes, spring follows. If something is lost, something else takes its place. Not immediately. Not painlessly, but eventually. Greek mythology didn't promise happiness. It promised movement. Even the underworld wasn't an end. It was a place of transition. A shadowed waiting room where memory and identity slowly changed. The Greeks didn't imagine eternal punishment for most souls. They imagined rest, stillness, forgetting. Sometimes forgetting was the reward. As belief systems shifted, this idea quietly survived. People stopped fearing gods, but they never stopped fearing time. And time in Greek mythology was never cruel. It was steady. Kronos didn't hate humans. He simply moved forward. The Greeks found comfort in that. If time keeps moving, pain doesn't stay frozen. If time keeps moving, loss eventually softens. If time keeps moving, even grief changes shape. That's why these myths are so gentle when you listen to them late at night. They don't trap you in the moment you're in. They remind you that moments pass. As this segment eases toward rest, notice how calm the tone has become. No warnings. No lessons. No heroes striving. Just motion. If your thoughts are drifting, let them. Stories like this don't need full attention. They simply need space. By this point, Greek mythology has moved far beyond belief. It no longer asks anything of you. It doesn't demand agreement, faith, or memory. It simply exists. And that is perhaps its greatest strength. The ancient Greeks never imagined their myths would survive for thousands of years. They told them because they felt necessary at the time. Because they made sense of a confusing world. But what they accidentally created was something flexible enough to adapt forever. When people stopped believing in gods, they didn't stop believing in patterns. Power still rose and fell. Pride still caused mistakes. Love still complicated everything. So the myths remained useful. They became quiet companions to thought. When someone today struggles with routine, they feel Sisyphus pushing the stone. When someone longs for home after a long journey, they feel Odysseus. When someone fears their own ambition, they feel Icarus. These aren't lessons taught in classrooms. They're feelings people recognize on their own. Greek mythology didn't survive because it was correct. It survived because it was accurate. It described human behavior without judgment. The gods were never perfect. The heroes never pure. The endings rarely clean. And that honesty allowed the stories to grow old gracefully. As modern life grew louder and faster, these ancient stories became strangely calming. They reminded people that chaos isn't new. Confusion isn't failure. Struggle isn't abnormal. Someone long ago felt this too, and left behind a story. As this segment begins to settle, notice how light the story feels now. It's no longer teaching. It's simply sharing space with you. Take another slow breath. At this point, the story doesn't need to move forward. It only needs to stay gentle. Greek mythology, when viewed from far enough away, feels less like a collection of events and more like a long memory shared by humanity. Not something learned. Something inherited. You didn't choose to know these stories. They reached you anyway. Through language. Through art. Through the way people describe their lives. And that's how myths truly survive. Not by being taught, but by being used. The Greeks understood that humans repeat themselves. Generations change. Technology changes. But emotions don't change very much. Fear still feels the same. Love still feels the same. Loss still feels the same. So the myths remained relevant without trying. They never needed updating. They only needed retelling. And sometimes, not even that. Sometimes they just needed to exist quietly in the background. When someone stands at a crossroads and hesitates, they are standing where countless mythic figures once stood. When someone looks back when they should move forward, Orpheus is there. When someone refuses to listen to warning signs, Icarus is there. These stories don't shout. They nod. They don't accuse. They recognize. Greek mythology never tried to improve humanity. It simply described it clearly. That clarity is comforting. Because it means confusion isn't personal. It's universal. As this segment begins to slow, notice how the myths now feel almost invisible. They no longer feel ancient. They feel familiar. That's not because they belong to the past. If your mind feels loose and unstructured now, that's exactly right. This part of the story doesn't ask you to follow, it asks you to rest. By this stage, Greek mythology has become almost transparent. You can look straight through it and still feel its shape. The stories are no longer something separate from life. They've blended into how people understand themselves. This is where myths stop feeling ancient. They begin to feel personal. When the Greeks spoke of destiny, they didn't imagine it as a strict path carved in stone. They imagined it as a tendency, a direction life often leaned toward. You could resist it, you could delay it, but completely escaping it was rare. That idea still exists. People speak of being meant for something, of feeling pulled in a certain direction, of knowing deep down where a choice might lead, even if they walk toward it anyway. That's fate spoken softly. And the Greeks were never angry about it. They accepted it with calm realism. They knew humans weren't designed for perfect control. They were designed for response. How you reacted mattered more than what happened. That's why heroes weren't judged by success alone. They were judged by character. Achilles was admired not because he won, but because he chose meaning over safety. Odysseus was respected not because he was powerful, but because he endured. Even failure carried dignity. In Greek mythology, trying mattered. And that idea aged well. Modern life often measures worth by outcomes, results, achievements. Greek mythology quietly disagreed. It measured worth by engagement, by effort, by willingness to face uncertainty. As this segment moves gently forward, notice how reassuring that idea feels. You don't have to solve everything. You don't have to win. You only have to keep responding. The myths never asked more than that. They never demanded perfection. They simply asked attention. And even that, only sometimes. As this segment eases toward rest, let that thought settle. Life doesn't need to be mastered. Take another slow breath. At this point, the story isn't moving forward anymore. It's settling. Greek mythology has reached a place where it no longer needs events. No gods acting. No heroes striving. No lessons unfolding. Only presence. If you look back over everything we've drifted through, from chaos to gods, from gods to heroes, from heroes to symbols, you can feel how naturally the stories loosen their grip. That was always their destination. The Greeks never believed humans were meant to live inside myths forever. Myths were guides, not cages. They were ways to carry meaning until people were ready to carry it themselves. And once that happened, the myths stepped aside. Quietly. Without resistance. This is something the Greeks understood deeply. Forcing belief weakens it. Letting belief breathe strengthens it. So the gods faded not because they were defeated, but because they had done their work. They had given humanity a shared language for fear and hope. After that, silence was enough. Even now, when people face moments that feel too large to explain, grief, awe, love, loss, they often fall silent. And that silence feels ancient, feels mythic, because before stories were told, there was silence. And after stories finish, there is silence again. Greek mythology completes a circle. Chaos to meaning. Meaning to memory. memory to quiet understanding. Nothing is forced at the end. Nothing is concluded neatly. That too is very Greek. Endings were never sharp in these stories. They blurred. They softened. Just like this. As this segment gently comes to rest, notice how calm everything feels. If your body feels heavy now, let it be heavy. Nothing in this story needs to be held anymore. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has almost completely dissolved into stillness. Not forgotten. Just resting. The ancient Greeks understood something subtle about stories. Stories are not meant to last forever in the same form. They are meant to travel. From voice to voice. From firelight to page. From belief to memory. And when they reach the end of that journey, they don't disappear. They become quiet knowledge. Greek mythology eventually stopped being something people believed in, and became something people recognized. Recognized in human behavior. Recognized in emotions that return again and again. Recognized in moments when logic feels too small to explain what's happening inside. That's when myth steps in, not loudly, not clearly, but gently. The Greeks never imagined a world without stories. They imagined a world where stories knew when to be silent. And that is where we are now. The gods no longer speak, but their shapes remain. Wisdom still feels calm and steady. Pride still feels dangerous. Love still feels overwhelming and beautiful and painful at the same time. These feelings don't need names anymore. They live naturally inside human experience. Greek mythology didn't fail when people stopped worshipping. It succeeded. It became part of how humans think without realizing it. That's the quiet goal of every great story. To disappear into the listener. As this segment slowly settles, there's no need to anticipate what comes next. Because nothing dramatic comes next. Only rest. Only the soft understanding that humans have always tried to explain their lives through stories, and always will. The names may change. The gods may fade. But the need remains. And somewhere long ago, people sat under the same sky, asked the same quiet questions, and told the same kind of stories. That connection is still here. You don't need to listen anymore. You only need to be here. By the time we reach this part of the story, Greek mythology has fully stepped into silence. Not an empty silence. A full one. The kind of silence that exists after a long conversation ends, when nothing more needs to be said. The ancient Greeks lived close to uncertainty. The sea was dangerous. Weather was unpredictable. Life was fragile. Stories helped them sit with that fragility. Not fix it. Not escape it. Just understand it. They never imagined a world where humans felt completely safe or completely certain. They imagined a world where humans learned how to live with uncertainty. That idea has aged very well. Even now, modern life offers answers, but not comfort. Explanations, but not peace. And that's where old stories quietly return. Not as belief. Not as instruction. As atmosphere. When life slows down at night, when the noise fades, when thoughts soften, the mind becomes more open to old patterns. Stories about cycles. Stories about change. Stories about endurance. Greek mythology doesn't rush to fill the silence. It respects it. The gods themselves learned this lesson. Zeus, once loud and uncontrollable, eventually became a symbol rather than a voice. Athena became an idea rather than a presence. Hades became a concept rather than a place. And when that happened, fear softened. Death stopped being punishment. It became transition. Time stopped being an enemy. It became movement. Failure stopped being shame. It became part of the pattern. The Greeks never tried to remove pain from life. They tried to make sense of it. And sometimes making sense is enough. As this segment gently settles, notice how the story now feels almost like breathing. No direction. No urgency. Settle in once more. If your thoughts are faint now, that's perfect. This part doesn't ask you to follow a story. It simply stays with you. By this stage, Greek mythology has fully released its need to explain anything. It no longer points. It no longer teaches. It rests. The ancient Greeks believed that understanding didn't always come from answers. Sometimes it came from familiarity, hearing the same stories again and again, recognizing the same patterns in different lives, seeing yourself reflected, quietly, in figures long gone. That repetition wasn't boring to them. It was comforting. Because repetition meant continuity. And continuity meant survival. When the world felt unpredictable, stories reminded people that others had felt the same confusion before. That fear had history. That hope had precedent. Greek mythology was never a map. It was a companion. Walking beside human experience, not leading it. And companions don't speak all the time. They know when silence is more helpful. As the myths aged, they learned this lesson well. They stopped announcing themselves. They stopped insisting on relevance. They trusted that humans would find them again when needed. And humans did. Not through temples or rituals, but through moments, a quiet realization, a familiar feeling, a sudden recognition that something old is repeating itself. In those moments, mythology is present without words. Just a sense of, this has happened before. And that sense is grounding. As this segment drifts toward rest, there's nothing to carry forward. No conclusion to remember. No insight to hold tightly. Just the calm understanding that stories don't need endings to be complete. Take a slow breath. If the edges of the story feel blurred now, let them blur. This part lives in that softness. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it no longer feels like something created by people. Feels like something discovered. As if the stories were always there, waiting quietly for humans to notice them. The ancient Greeks didn't see themselves as inventors of myth. They believed stories rose naturally from the world around them. From the rhythm of waves. From the movement of stars. From the way joy arrived suddenly and left just as quietly. Myth wasn't separate from life. It was woven into it. That's why these stories don't age the way facts do. Facts become outdated. Stories deepen. As centuries passed, Greek mythology stopped being about explanation and became about recognition. Recognition of patterns. Recognition of feelings. Recognition of the strange familiarity of being human. You can read these myths at any age and find something different. As a child, they feel magical. As an adult, they feel accurate. Late at night, they feel honest. They don't hide the messiness of life. They sit with it. The Greeks didn't imagine heroes who were calm and balanced. They imagined heroes who struggled. They didn't imagine gods who were kind and just. They imagined gods who were powerful and flawed. Because power without imperfection felt unrealistic. And realism, even in myth, mattered to them. As this segment moves slowly forward, notice how little tension remains in the story. There's no build-up, no climax, just presence. This is where stories become background music to thought. Not something you focus on, something you feel. And perhaps that's the final gift Greek mythology offers. Not answers, not rules, but companionship. A quiet reminder that long before you were here, someone felt the same confusion, the same wonder, the same exhaustion. If your breathing is slow now, let it stay that way. Nothing in this part needs effort. By the time Greek mythology reaches this moment, it has almost fully merged with stillness. The stories are no longer moving forward. They are resting in place. This is where myths stop being remembered as stories and start being felt as atmosphere. The ancient Greeks understood something subtle about rest. Rest wasn't the absence of thought. It was the absence of struggle. Their myths didn't aim to resolve every question. They allowed questions to remain open. That openness created space. Space for wonder. Space for uncertainty. Space for quiet acceptance. And that's why these stories feel so natural late at night. At night, the world stops demanding clarity. It stops asking for decisions. It allows things to exist without explanation. Greek mythology fits perfectly into that state. It doesn't rush toward meaning. It lets meaning appear on its own, if it appears at all. The gods no longer speak here. They don't need to. Their presence is already understood. Wisdom feels calm. Time feels steady. Loss feels softened by distance. Nothing needs to be named anymore. As this segment gently drifts, notice how the story feels almost like silence with words inside it. The words aren't important now. The rhythm is. The same rhythm the Greeks watched in waves, seasons, and stars. That rhythm is older than myth. Myth simply learned how to describe it. As this segment comes to rest, there's no sense of ending. Only continuation. Stories don't stop. They slow that there's no need to hold on to anything now. The story knows where to go on its own. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has become almost indistinguishable from quiet thought itself. Not something told. Something felt. The ancient Greeks never separated life into important moments and unimportant ones. Everything mattered because everything passed. A sunrise. A conversation. A loss that slowly softened with time. Their myths reflected this understanding. They didn't focus only on great victories. They lingered on waiting. On longing. On the space between events. That space was where meaning lived. And that's where we are now. In Greek mythology, even the gods eventually learned to be still. Zeus stopped intervening. Apollo stopped speaking. Athena stopped advising. Not because they lost power, but because power had already done what it could. After that, quiet was enough. This idea feels unfamiliar in modern life. We're taught to act, to fix, to improve. The Greeks allowed themselves something else. Acceptance. Not resignation. Acceptance. They knew that some things don't need solutions. They need time. Time to change shape. Time to become memory instead of pain. That's why their myths never rush grief. They let it move at its own pace. Demeter doesn't immediately recover Persephone. Orpheus doesn't immediately let go. Odysseus doesn't return home quickly. Waiting is part of the story. And waiting is not empty. It's full of quiet understanding. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how little effort it takes to remain here. The story is no longer asking you to imagine gods or heroes. It's simply matching the rhythm of your breath. Slow. Steady. Unforced. If your thoughts feel slow now, let them stay slow. Nothing needs your attention anymore. By this point, Greek mythology has almost completely become silence with meaning inside it. The stories are no longer guiding you anywhere. They are simply keeping you company. The ancient Greeks believed that wisdom didn't always arrive through effort. Sometimes it arrived through stillness. They watched the sea not to control it, but to understand it. They watched the stars not to change them, but to feel their order. Their myths reflected that patience. Not every story moved forward. Some simply stayed. And staying was enough. In Greek mythology, even the concept of knowledge had a quiet side. Athena represented wisdom, but not urgency. She waited. She observed. She acted only when needed. That kind of wisdom doesn't shout. It settles. And that's the feeling here now. The myths are no longer teaching. They're no longer warning. They're resting beside you like something familiar you don't need to name. At this stage, the story isn't about gods, heroes, or fate. It's about continuity. The understanding that humans have always tried to make sense of life, and that trying itself is enough. No conclusion is required. No resolution is demanded. As this segment eases toward rest, notice how natural the quiet feels. There's nothing missing, nothing unfinished, just space. Take one more slow breath. There's no need to stay awake for this part. The story doesn't mind if you drift. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully let go of structure. There is no beginning to return to, no ending to approach, only presence. The ancient Greeks believed that everything meaningful eventually becomes simple. Complex questions fade. Sharp emotions soften. What remains is understanding without explanation. Their myths followed the same path. They began with noise, thunder, war, jealousy, love. And they ended with quiet. Not because life became easier, but because familiarity replaced fear. When you know something well enough, it stops frightening you. Greek mythology allowed people to sit with life long enough for fear to lose its edge. That is why these stories still feel calming thousands of years later. They don't promise safety. They promise recognition. They say, this feeling has been here before. And it passed. Even the gods eventually accepted this. They stopped fighting fate. They stopped reshaping the world. They learned stillness. And in that stillness, humans learned something important. Control is limited. Understanding is not. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how the story feels almost like a memory you're not sure belongs to you. That's how old stories survive. They stop belonging to anyone in particular. They become shared. There is nothing left to resolve here. Nothing left to anticipate. Only a gentle sense of continuation. Breath after breath. Moment after moment. If your awareness feels distant now, that's perfectly fine. This part doesn't need to be followed. It only needs to exist. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has become almost indistinguishable from rest itself. The stories no longer unfold in sequence. They hover, light, calm, uninsistent. The ancient Greeks believed that when something lasts long enough, it stops needing explanation. It simply becomes part of the world. Their myths reached that stage long ago. They stopped being stories told aloud, and became a quiet background to human thought. Like the sound of waves you no longer consciously hear. Like the passing of time you no longer count. The gods, once vivid and demanding, softened into qualities. Wisdom without urgency. Strength without aggression. Desire without command. Even fate lost its sharpness. It stopped feeling like a sentence, and started feeling like a current. Something you move with, not against. The Greeks never imagined peace as the absence of motion. They imagined it as harmony. Movement without struggle. Change without panic. That harmony is what these stories slowly point toward. Not perfection. Not resolution. Balance. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how the story no longer pulls your attention. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't offer answers. It simply keeps you company in the quiet. Take a gentle breath. There is nothing left to follow now. Only a rhythm to rest inside. By the time Greek mythology reaches this stage, it has fully blended with the quiet awareness that comes just before sleep deepens. The stories no longer move forward. They don't circle back either. They simply remain. The ancient Greeks understood that not everything meaningful needs motion. Some things gain value by staying still. A mountain doesn't hurry. The sea doesn't explain itself. Night doesn't announce its arrival. Myth learned from these things. Over time, the gods stopped acting because action was no longer necessary. Their work had been absorbed into human understanding. Courage became internal. Wisdom became intuitive. Fear became familiar. Nothing needed a name anymore. This is the place where myths quietly hand responsibility back to the listener. Not responsibility to believe. Not responsibility to remember. Just responsibility to live. And even that feels gentle here. The Greeks believed that a life well lived wasn't one without struggle. It was one that moved in rhythm with change. Their stories don't resist change. They soften into it. As this segment slowly settles, notice how the story feels almost like a pause between breaths. Not empty. Not full. If the world feels far away, let it stay there. Nothing here asks for effort. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has finished becoming a story. What remains is presence without form. The ancient Greeks believed that when something has been understood deeply enough, it no longer needs words. Words fall away. Meaning stays. Their myths followed that path. They began as explanations. They became stories. They turned into symbols. And finally, they softened into quiet understanding. That was never failure. That was completion. The gods were never meant to remain loud forever. They were bridges, between fear and familiarity, between chaos and calm. Once the crossing was made, the bridge didn't need attention anymore. And now, here at the far end of the journey, nothing needs to happen. No insight needs to land. No lesson needs to be remembered. The Greeks understood that rest itself was sacred. Sleep was protected by Hypnos. Dreams were shaped by Morpheus. Even the gods respected that boundary. Because rest was not escape. It was renewal. As this segment gently settles, let the story dissolve into the rhythm of your breath. The same rhythm that carried waves to shore. The same rhythm that moved seasons forward. The same rhythm that carried stories across thousands of years. Greek mythology doesn't end here. It simply becomes quiet enough to disappear into you. There is no need to listen for meaning anymore. Meaning has already arrived. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has become something very close to silence itself. Not empty silence. A gentle, full quiet, the kind that feels safe. The ancient Greeks believed that understanding was not a moment. It was a gradual softening. At first, humans tried to explain everything. Then they told stories. Later they reflected. And finally they rested inside what they already knew. Myth followed the same rhythm. The gods did not disappear suddenly. They faded slowly the way sound fades after a long day. Zeus did not lose his power. Power simply stopped needing a face. Athena did not lose her wisdom. Wisdom became internal. Apollo did not stop shining. Light became ordinary, expected, comforting. And Hades did not become frightening. He became inevitable and therefore calm. This was the Greeks' quiet gift to the future. They showed that fear often comes from unfamiliarity. And that familiarity over time becomes peace. That is why these stories feel so gentle now. They no longer warn. They no longer impress. They reassure. They say, "You have been here before. Others have felt this too. You are not late. You are not early. You are simply here." As this segment slowly settles, notice how the story no longer asks anything from you. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't need belief. It simply keeps the same rhythm as your breathing. Slow, steady, unforced. This is where mythology rests, not at an ending but inside continuity. Moment after moment, breath after breath, that there's nowhere to go now. The story has already arrived where it needs to be. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it no longer feels ancient or modern. It feels timeless. The ancient Greeks believed that time was not something to be chased. It was something to move with. They watched how everything repeated itself in quiet ways. Day followed night. Breath followed breath. Joy followed sorrow, and sorrow eventually softened. Their myths mirrored that rhythm. Nothing truly began. Nothing truly ended. Everything transitioned. This understanding made them unusually calm about change. When cities fell, stories remained. When rulers vanished, patterns returned. When lives ended, memory continued. Greek mythology was never about preserving moments. It was about accepting movement. And now here, movement has slowed almost completely. The stories no longer travel outward. They settle inward. They don't seek listeners. They wait patiently inside whoever happens to hear them. That patience is important. The Greeks believed that meaning reveals itself only when forced effort stops. You cannot demand understanding. You cannot hurry peace. You allow them. And allowing is what this part of the story does best. As this segment gently eases forward, notice how natural the quiet feels. There is no emptiness here. Only space. And space, the Greeks believed, was where balance lived. This is where myths finally become indistinguishable from rest. Not because they are gone, that there's nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to prepare for. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully settled into something softer than narrative. It has become rhythm. The ancient Greeks noticed rhythm everywhere. In footsteps on stone roads. In oars cutting through water. In the rise and fall of breath. Their myths followed the same pattern. Action. Pause. Silence. Not every moment needed meaning. Some moments simply needed to pass. That idea is deeply restful. Modern life often insists that everything must matter immediately. Every feeling explained. Every thought resolved. Greek mythology quietly disagreed. It allowed moments to exist without urgency. Heroes waited. Gods hesitated. Fate unfolded slowly. Nothing was rushed. And because nothing was rushed, fear softened. By now, the gods are no longer figures. They are qualities. Strength feels steady. Wisdom feels patient. Love feels complex but familiar. No one needs to name them. Naming is no longer necessary. This is where myths become internal language, a way of sensing life rather than explaining it. As this segment drifts forward, notice how the story feels almost like background breath. You're not listening to it. You're sharing space with it. That is the final transformation of myth. From story, to symbol, to silence, to presence. There's nothing to reach for now. The story has already settled around you. By the time Greek mythology reaches this stage, it no longer feels like something being told. It feels like something being shared quietly. The ancient Greeks understood that the deepest truths were not loud. They didn't arrive with thunder or fire. They arrived slowly through repetition. Seeing the same sunrise again and again. Hearing the same waves return to shore. Living through loss, then living again. Their myths reflected this patience. They never tried to convince anyone. They simply stayed present long enough to be recognized. And recognition brings calm. When you recognize a feeling, it loses its edge. When you recognize a pattern, it stops surprising you. Greek mythology trained people to recognize life. Not to master it. Not to control it. Just to see it clearly. By now, the gods are no longer distant beings. They feel like familiar moods. Wisdom feels like quiet clarity. Power feels like responsibility. Desire feels like motion without certainty. Nothing here needs a face or a name. As this segment moves gently forward, notice how the story doesn't pull your attention. It doesn't push ideas. It doesn't ask questions. It simply rests in the same space as you're breathing. That shared space is where myths finally belong. Not in temples. Not in books. But in the quiet moments when thinking slows and understanding doesn't need words. Nothing needs to change now. The story is no longer moving, it is resting with you. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully released the need to be understood. Understanding has already happened. The ancient Greeks believed that wisdom was not something added to life. It was something uncovered when noise faded. When questions stopped chasing answers. When effort softened into attention. Their myths followed this same gentle path. They began with explanation. They passed through wonder. They lingered in reflection. And finally, they arrived at quiet acceptance. That acceptance was never passive. It was calm. The Greeks knew that calm does not mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening at the right pace. That belief shaped their stories. Heroes did not rush their fate. Gods did not hurry decisions. Even destiny unfolded slowly, allowing space for breath. This slow unfolding is what makes these myths feel so natural when the world becomes quiet. Late at night, urgency dissolves. Goals loosen their grip. Thoughts wander without needing direction. Greek mythology belongs to this hour. By now, the stories no longer describe events. They describe states of being. Stillness. Acceptance. Continuity. The gods are no longer personalities. They are sensations. Strength feels grounded. Wisdom feels spacious. Time feels gentle rather than pressing. Nothing needs to be named. Naming would only disturb the calm. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how effortlessly the story blends with silence. There is no contrast anymore. Story and quiet have become the same thing, that there's nothing left to wait for, nothing left to arrive. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully dissolved into familiarity. Not something new, not something old, just something known. The ancient Greeks believed that the most enduring truths were the ones you stopped noticing because they felt natural. Breathing, change, time passing. Their myths didn't try to compete with these truths. They aligned with them. That alignment created peace. Stories no longer needed to surprise. They only needed to remain. And remaining is what they did best. The gods, once dramatic and restless, softened into background forces. Not because they lost relevance, but because they became integrated. Wisdom stopped arriving as advice. It arrived as intuition. Strength stopped appearing as victory. It appeared as endurance. Love stopped being dramatic. It became familiar, complex, and steady. This quiet integration is what makes Greek mythology feel timeless rather than ancient. It doesn't belong to a period. It belongs to experience. By now, the story isn't something you follow line by line. It's something you float inside. The words come and go. The calm stays. As this segment moves gently toward rest, notice how the sense of separation has disappeared. There is no storyteller, no listener, just shared stillness. Rest quietly where you are. Nothing needs to shift now. The story has already found its place. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it no longer feels like something created long ago. It feels like something that has always been present. The ancient Greeks believed that familiarity was not the enemy of wonder. It was its final form. When something becomes familiar, it stops demanding attention. It stops startling you. And in that calm, a deeper appreciation appears. Their myths followed that same path. At first the gods amazed, then they instructed. Later they reflected. And finally they became quietly known. That quiet knowing is where we are now. The stories no longer carry tension. They don't move toward resolution. They simply exist like a steady horizon. The Greeks trusted this state. They understood that not everything meaningful needs movement. Some things gain depth by remaining still. By now, mythology feels less like language and more like atmosphere. You don't hear it, you sense it. A gentle reassurance that life has always unfolded this way. That confusion has always softened with time. That nothing you feel is out of place. This reassurance is subtle, but it's powerful. It doesn't remove difficulty. It removes isolation. As this segment drifts gently forward, notice how the story no longer competes with your thoughts. It doesn't interrupt them. It doesn't guide them. It simply stays nearby. Remain at rest. There is nothing left to hold on to. Nothing left to release. By the time Greek mythology reaches this stage, it has become almost indistinguishable from quiet awareness itself. The ancient Greeks believed that when something is fully understood, it no longer needs to announce itself. It simply is. Their myths arrived at that place slowly. Not through conclusions. Not through answers. Through familiarity. Hearing the same stories across generations. Seeing the same patterns repeat in different lives. Recognizing that what once felt overwhelming eventually softened. This recognition brought peace. And peace was never dramatic in Greek thought. It was subtle, steady, unforced. By now, the gods are no longer characters. They are qualities woven into experience. Wisdom feels like calm clarity. Strength feels like quiet endurance. Time feels gentle rather than urgent. Nothing here needs explanation. Explanation would only disturb the balance. As this segment moves gently forward, notice how the story feels almost like the space between thoughts. Not empty. Not full. Balanced. The Greeks valued this balance deeply. They called it harmony. Harmony between effort and rest. Between knowing and accepting. Between movement and stillness. Greek mythology was never meant to pull you forward endlessly. It was meant to bring you here. This quiet midpoint where nothing presses and nothing pulls. As this segment settles, let the words fade naturally. Stay exactly where you are. Nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to happen. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has become almost invisible. Not because it has faded away, but because it has blended completely into human awareness. The ancient Greeks believed that the most powerful influences were the ones you stopped noticing. Gravity doesn't announce itself. Breath doesn't demand attention. Time doesn't explain where it's going. Myth learned to move the same way. At first it spoke loudly. Then it spoke clearly. Then it spoke softly. And finally it stopped speaking at all. That silence was not emptiness. It was trust. Trust that the stories had already settled where they needed to settle. By now, mythology no longer carries images or names. It carries feeling. A calm acceptance that life unfolds in waves. That clarity comes and goes. That nothing stays sharp forever. The Greeks never expected peace to feel exciting. They expected it to feel familiar. That familiarity is here now. The story no longer asks you to imagine gods or worlds. It simply mirrors the quiet rhythm of being alive. Nothing added. Nothing removed. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how the sense of separation has almost disappeared. There is no ancient world and modern world. No past and present. Only continuity. There is nothing left to follow. Nothing left to resolve. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully completed its transformation. It is no longer story. No longer symbol. No longer lesson. It is simply presence. The ancient Greeks believed that everything meaningful eventually returns to simplicity. After all the names, after all the struggles, after all the explanations, what remains is calm recognition. They understood that life does not need to be constantly interpreted. Sometimes it only needs to be experienced quietly. Their myths followed that same arc. They began as answers. They became narratives. They softened into understanding. And finally they rested. The gods were never meant to stay vivid forever. They were temporary shapes for timeless experiences. Once those experiences became familiar, the shapes were no longer necessary. And now here nothing is being shaped. Nothing is being taught. There is only rhythm. The slow rise and fall of breath. The gentle passing of moments. The steady continuation that needs no commentary. Greek mythology does not conclude with a final message. It dissolves into silence, into rest, into the quiet knowing that humans have always told stories to accompany themselves through the night. And when the night becomes deep enough, even stories learn how to sleep. There is nothing to listen for now, nothing to understand. By the time Greek mythology reaches this stage, it has fully settled into stillness. Not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of completion. The ancient Greeks believed that when something had served its purpose, it did not vanish. It became quiet, like embers after a long fire. Warm, steady, no longer needing flame. Their myths followed the same path. Once they helped people name the unknown. Later they helped people face it. And eventually they helped people rest beside it. That resting was never emptiness. It was trust. Trust that life did not need constant explanation. Trust that confusion softened with time. Trust that meaning revealed itself without force. By now the gods no longer feel distant or close. They feel integrated. Wisdom is no longer advice. It's instinct. Strength is no longer conquest. It's endurance. Time is no longer pressure. It's movement without urgency. Nothing needs to be separated anymore. As this segment drifts gently forward, notice how the story feels like it's breathing with you. Not guiding. Not leading. Just accompanying. This is where mythology completes its quiet work. There is nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to complete. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully accepted silence as its final language. The ancient Greeks understood that silence was not the opposite of meaning. It was where meaning eventually rested. After stories were told enough times, after patterns were recognized enough times, words naturally fell away. What remained was understanding without effort. Their myths were never meant to stay loud forever. They were bridges, meant to be crossed, not lived on. Once people learned how to walk on their own, the bridges didn't disappear. They simply became part of the landscape. That is where Greek mythology now exists. Not as a destination, not as a guide, as terrain. Something steady beneath thought. Something familiar beneath feeling. By now, the gods no longer feel separate from human experience. Wisdom feels like quiet awareness. Power feels like responsibility carried gently. Love feels complex, steady, and known. Nothing here needs to be named. Names would only disturb the calm. As this segment eases forward, notice how the story feels almost like the pause between heartbeats. Brief, gentle, complete. This is where mythology finally stops moving outward and settles inward. There is nothing left to reach for. Nothing left to hold. By the time Greek mythology arrives here, it has completely let go of the need to be remembered as mythology. It has become something simpler. A feeling of continuity. The ancient Greeks believed that the truest understanding was not sharp or dramatic. It was soft. It arrived slowly without announcing itself. Their stories were never meant to cling to attention forever. They were meant to accompany life until life no longer needed explanation. That moment has arrived here. The myths have done their work. They no longer describe gods or heroes. They no longer trace beginnings or endings. They simply reflect the steady rhythm that has always been present. Breath. Pause. Breath again. The Greeks trusted this rhythm deeply. They saw it in tides, in seasons, in the rise and fall of human emotion. And because they trusted it, they were not afraid to become quiet. Silence was not loss. It was arrival. As this segment drifts gently forward, notice how the story feels almost like it has disappeared. But something remains. A calm familiarity. A sense that nothing here is new, and nothing is wrong. That sense is the final inheritance of Greek mythology. Not knowledge, not belief, recognition. Recognition that humans have always sat in the quiet, wondering softly and finding comfort in shared stories. And when those stories are no longer needed, they fade without resistance. There is nothing left to understand. Nothing left to follow. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has completely settled into quiet familiarity. Not something you think about. Something you live beside. The ancient Greeks believed that wisdom did not arrive as a final answer. It arrived as a sense of ease with uncertainty. They never tried to remove mystery from life. They learned how to live gently inside it. Their myths reflected this acceptance. They didn't insist on clarity. They allowed ambiguity to breathe. And over time that breathing became calm. By now the stories are no longer stories. They are moods. A sense of patience when things take time. A sense of balance when emotions pull in different directions. A sense of humility when control feels limited. These moods don't need explanation. They arrive naturally. Greek mythology trained people to notice these inner shifts without panic. To recognize that not knowing is not failure. It is part of being human. As this segment drifts slowly forward, notice how the story no longer occupies space in your thoughts. It sits beneath them. Supporting. Steady. Unobtrusive. This is where myths finally become invisible. Not forgotten. Integrated. They no longer ask for attention because they no longer need it. As this segment comes to rest, let the quiet remain. There is nothing left to arrive at. Nothing left to become. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully blended into quiet awareness. Not something separate from you. Something gently present. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest understanding came when effort stopped trying to grasp meaning. When you stopped asking, why is this happening? And allowed the moment to simply be what it was. Their myths were never meant to solve life. They were meant to soften it. And softness lasts. Over time the story stopped pointing outward, to gods, to heavens, to distant realms. They turned inward, toward acceptance, toward patience, toward a calm relationship with change. By now the gods have no edges. They are not figures or forces. They are feelings that pass through human experience. Wisdom feels like quiet knowing. Time feels like steady flow. Loss feels less sharp when held gently. Nothing here asks for interpretation. Interpretation would only add noise. As this segment moves slowly forward, notice how the story feels almost like the space between thoughts. You are not following it. You are resting inside it. That is where mythology finally belongs. Not in memory. Not in belief. In the quiet recognition that life has always moved this way, and always will. As this segment comes to rest, let the silence continue. There is nothing left to complete. Nothing left to understand. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully settled into the background of being itself. Not something remembered. Not something recalled. Something simply present. The ancient Greeks believed that when understanding became complete, it no longer needed attention. Like balance while standing. Like breathing while sleeping. Their myths arrived here slowly. They moved from explanation, to story, to symbol, to quiet familiarity. And now, even familiarity has softened. What remains is calm continuity. The Greeks never imagined peace as excitement or certainty. They imagined it as ease. Ease with change. Ease with not knowing. Ease with time passing without resistance. That ease is here now. The gods have fully released their forms. They are no longer shapes or names. They are sensations that pass through life without interruption. Strength feels steady. Wisdom feels spacious. Time feels gentle and unhurried. Nothing asks to be held. Nothing asks to be released. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how the story no longer feels like sound. Feels like space. And space, the Greeks believed, was the final teacher. Not empty space. Living space. Space where everything is allowed to be as it is. This is where mythology completes its longest journey. Not with an ending. Not with a conclusion. There is nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to resolve. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has completely stepped out of language. What remains is not story, not symbol, not idea. It is ease. The ancient Greeks believed that the highest form of understanding did not feel dramatic. It felt natural. Like resting after a long walk. Like knowing you don't need to go anywhere else. Their myths slowly moved toward that place. At first they named fear. Then they shaped it into gods. Later they recognized it as human. And finally they let it go. This letting go was never loss. It was trust. Trust that life continues without explanation. Trust that meaning does not disappear when words fall silent. Trust that rest is not emptiness. By now the myths are no longer around you. They are within the same stillness as your breath. Nothing needs to be remembered. Nothing needs to be carried forward. The Greeks understood that carrying too much prevented rest. So they allowed stories to dissolve when they were no longer needed. As this segment drifts softly onward, notice how the sense of story has almost vanished. What remains is calm presence. A quiet sense that nothing is missing. That nothing is unfinished. That this moment, exactly as it is enough. There is nothing left to follow. Nothing left to become. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully released its last attachment to form. No images. No names. No movement. Only stillness with meaning inside it. The ancient Greeks believed that when something had been lived with long enough, it no longer needed to be explained. It became familiar. And familiarity brought peace. Their myths traveled a long distance to arrive here. From chaos to order. From noise to quiet. From wonder to acceptance. That journey was never about arriving somewhere new. It was about returning to something simple. A sense that life continues without being pushed. That time moves without being chased. That meaning does not vanish when words stop. By now, the myths are no longer something you hear. They are something you rest inside. Like a memory you don't need to recall. Like a feeling that doesn't need a name. The Greeks trusted this state deeply. They believed that rest was not the absence of life. It was life without resistance. And resistance has fully softened here. As this segment gently settles, notice how nothing is being asked of you. No understanding. No attention. No effort. Just the steady rhythm that has always been present. Breath. Pause. Breath again. This is where mythology completes its quiet purpose. Not by saying more, but by allowing silence to remain undisturbed. There is nowhere left to arrive. Nothing left to unfold. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully merged with quiet awareness. Not as memory. Not as story. As presence. The ancient Greeks believed that when something truly belongs, it no longer needs to be noticed. It simply supports everything else. Like the ground beneath your feet. Like the sky you don't question. Like time passing without asking permission. Their myths slowly learned to do the same. They stopped explaining life. And began accompanying it. That companionship is what remains here. No God speaking. No heroes acting. No fate unfolding. Just a gentle sense of continuity. The Greeks understood that continuity was comforting. It meant nothing was broken. Nothing had gone wrong. Life moved the way it always had. Rise. Fall. Return. By now, even those movements have softened. Everything feels steady. As this segment drifts quietly forward, notice how the story no longer has edges. No beginning to remember. No ending to anticipate. Only a calm middle that stretches comfortably in all directions. This is where mythology finally becomes invisible. Not lost. Integrated. It rests beneath thought, beneath memory, beneath effort. Remain completely at ease. There is nothing left to listen for. Nothing left to hold. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully become rest itself. Not a story being told. Not an idea being shared. Just quiet presence. The ancient Greeks believed that everything meaningful eventually returned to simplicity. After all the words, after all the names, after all the images, what remained was calm familiarity. They understood that life did not need constant explanation to continue. It needed space. It needed time. It needed patience. Their myths followed that same gentle return. They began as attempts to understand the unknown. They became stories that carried meaning. And finally, they softened into something that no longer needed to speak. That softening is complete here. The gods are no longer shapes or forces. They are no longer qualities or symbols. They are quiet acceptance. Acceptance that change happens. Acceptance that time moves. Acceptance that nothing needs to be forced. By now, the story is not separate from silence. It is woven into it. like the pause between breaths, like the stillness just before sleep deepens. The Greeks trusted this stillness. They believed it was where renewal began. As this segment gently settles, let everything else fade. No memory required. No understanding required. There is nothing left to reach for. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has moved beyond story, beyond memory, beyond even symbolism. It has become a quiet companionship. The ancient Greeks believed that the truest comfort came not from answers, but from familiarity. From knowing that life moved in patterns. From trusting that change was not an enemy. Their myths slowly taught this without instruction. They showed that beginnings often feel confusing, that middles feel endless, and that endings rarely feel sharp. Instead, endings soften into something else. This is where we are now. The stories no longer explain the world. They simply exist alongside it. Like an old path you no longer consciously follow, but still know how to walk. By now the gods are not absent. They are unnecessary. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded. They helped humans recognize fear, love, pride, loss, patience. And once those feelings became familiar, the gods stepped back. Silence took their place. That silence is gentle. It does not erase meaning. It holds it. As this segment drifts quietly onward, notice how the story no longer feels like something external. Feels like space. A calm, steady space where nothing presses and nothing pulls. The Greeks trusted this space deeply. They believed it was where balance lived. And balance, once found, does not need to speak. There is nothing left to arrive at. Nothing left to resolve. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has completely relaxed into quiet awareness. Not something you remember. Something that simply remains. The ancient Greeks believed that when something truly belonged to life, it stopped demanding attention. It became background, supportive, steady. Their myths learned to do the same. They no longer stood in front of human experience. They settled beneath it, like the rhythm of walking, like the pattern of seasons, like breath moving without instruction. By now, the stories are no longer separate from silence. They are woven into it. The gods are not distant. They are not near. They are unnecessary. Not because they were forgotten, but because their meanings were absorbed. Wisdom no longer needs a figure. Strength no longer needs a test. Time no longer needs a warning. Everything moves gently on its own. As this segment drifts toward rest, notice how the story no longer feels like sound. Feels like space. A wide, calm space where nothing needs to be named and nothing needs to be held. The Greeks trusted this state. They believed that rest was not an ending. It was a continuation without effort. And here, effort has fully dissolved. As the words soften and fade, allow the quiet to remain undisturbed. This is where mythology finally rests. Not as story, not as memory, but as calm presence. There is nothing left to do. Nothing left to understand. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully become quiet continuity. Not something that unfolds. Something that simply carries on. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was seen clearly enough, it no longer needed explanation. It needed trust. Trust that day follows night. Trust that sorrow softens. Trust that nothing stays sharp forever. Their myths slowly taught this by example. They did not rush conclusions. They allowed time to do the work. And time, the Greeks knew, was patient. By now, the stories have released even the need to comfort. They rest naturally, the way familiarity rests. You don't notice it. You don't seek it. It is simply there. The gods no longer guide. They no longer warn. They have become quiet agreement with how things are. Wisdom feels like ease. Strength feels like steadiness. Life feels like movement without resistance. As this segment drifts gently forward, notice how the story no longer feels separate from stillness. Words appear. Words fade. The calm remains. This is where mythology reaches its most complete form. Not as meaning explained, but as meaning allowed. There is nothing left to reach for. Nothing left to release. By the time Greek mythology arrives here, it has fully settled into gentle continuation. Not movement. Not stillness. Something in between. The ancient Greeks believed that balance was not a fixed point. It was a living state. They watched balance in nature. In tides that rose and fell. In seasons that shifted without hurry. In breath that never stayed in one place for long. Their myths learned this rhythm. They stopped insisting on form. They stopped holding shape. They allowed meaning to move freely without pressure. By now, the stories no longer comfort you deliberately. They don't try. Comfort happens naturally when nothing resists. The gods are no longer figures you imagine. They are the quiet sense that things are unfolding as they should. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but steadily. That steadiness is what remains here. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel lighter now. They don't land. They pass through. What stays is calm familiarity. The Greeks trusted this state deeply. They believed it was where harmony lived. Not loud harmony. Not dramatic harmony. A soft agreement between life and awareness. As this segment eases to rest, let everything else soften with it. No conclusion is forming. No ending is approaching. There is nothing left to move toward. Nothing left to step away from. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully become quiet continuity. Not silence that feels empty, but silence that feels complete. The ancient Greeks believed that when something was truly understood, it no longer asked for attention. It simply supported everything else. Like the ground beneath a long walk. Like the horizon that never rushes closer. Like night arriving without effort. Their myths slowly learned to exist this way. They stopped needing events. They stopped needing drama. They stopped needing memory. What remained was a gentle agreement with life as it unfolds. By now, even the idea of myth feels unnecessary. There are no stories being told here. No meanings being offered. Only the steady sense that nothing is missing. The Greeks trusted this feeling deeply. They believed peace was not something added at the end of understanding. It was what appeared when resistance disappeared. Here, resistance has fully softened. Thoughts may come and go. Words may appear and fade. But the calm underneath does not move. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how effortless everything feels. There is no striving. No waiting. No expectation. Just the same quiet rhythm that has always been present. Breath. Pause. Breath again. There is nothing left to arrive at. Nothing left to resolve. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully settled into effortless continuity. Not something that progresses. Not something that concludes. Something that simply remains. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest form of peace was not excitement, not certainty, but familiarity. The calm that comes when nothing feels urgent anymore. Their myths slowly moved toward that calm. At first they shaped fear into gods. Then they shaped hope into heroes. Later they recognized both as human. And finally they let both rest. By now the stories no longer hold shape. They do not gather attention. They do not request memory. They exist like background warmth. Like the quiet awareness that continues even when thoughts fade. The gods have fully released their final outlines. They are no longer figures, symbols, or lessons. They are agreement. Agreement with change. Agreement with time. Agreement with the gentle unfolding of life. Nothing here needs correction. Nothing here needs improvement. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel less like sound and more like space. They appear. They dissolve. The calm remains untouched. The Greeks trusted this state deeply. They believed it was where harmony lived. Not as balance achieved, but as balance allowed. As this segment eases into rest, let everything soften naturally. No ending approaches. No conclusion forms. Only the quiet continuation that has always been here. There is nowhere else to go. Nothing else to become. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully relaxed into simple presence. Not an idea to follow. Not a story to remember. Just a steady sense of being. The ancient Greeks believed that when something had completed its work, it did not disappear. It became quiet support. Like the earth beneath a city. Like the air holding sound. Like time carrying moments without asking anything in return. Their myths learned to live this way. They stopped standing in front of human experience. They moved underneath it. Holding. Not directing. By now, the stories no longer describe gods, heroes, or fate. They describe nothing at all. And that nothing is full. Full of calm familiarity. Full of trust in rhythm. Full of acceptance that life unfolds on its own terms. The Greeks never imagined peace as something dramatic. They imagined it as ease. Ease with not knowing. Ease with waiting. Ease with letting moments pass without interference. That ease is here now. As this segment drifts forward, notice how the words no longer try to land. They float. They pass. What remains is the quiet steadiness beneath them. Breath comes. Breath goes. Nothing more is required. This is where mythology no longer speaks. Not because it has nothing left to say, but because everything has already been understood. There is nothing left to search for. Nothing left to arrive at. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has completely settled into quiet continuity. Not moving forward. Not moving backward. simply being. The ancient Greeks believed that the most lasting truths did not feel heavy. They felt light. So familiar that you stopped noticing them. Like the feeling of gravity when you lie down. Like the rhythm of breath when sleep deepens. Like time passing without resistance. Their myths slowly learned to exist this way. They did not try to remain important. They allowed themselves to become natural. By now, the stories no longer carry meaning as something separate. Meaning has merged with calm awareness. There is no lesson forming. No insight approaching. And that is exactly right. The Greeks trusted this stage deeply. They believed that when effort faded, harmony appeared on its own. Harmony not as balance achieved, but as balance allowed. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the words feel almost transparent. They pass through without friction. They leave no trace. What remains is steadiness. A quiet sense that nothing is wrong. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be adjusted. This is where mythology no longer belongs to the past or the present. It belongs to stillness. And stillness, once reached, does not need to speak. There is nothing left to anticipate. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully blended into quiet awareness. Not as story. Not as memory. As background presence. The ancient Greeks believed that when understanding became complete, it stopped feeling like knowledge. It felt like ease. Ease with change. Ease with uncertainty. Ease with letting moments pass without holding them. Their myths slowly moved toward this ease. They did not force conclusions. They allowed time to soften everything. And time, they knew, always does. By now, even the idea of continuation feels unnecessary. There is no direction here. No progression. Only a steady sense of calm familiarity. The gods no longer appear. The heroes no longer act. Not because they vanished, but because they are no longer needed. Their work has been absorbed into how life is felt. As this segment drifts forward, notice how the words no longer ask to be heard. They simply pass through the quiet. Breath comes. Breath goes. Nothing else is required. There is nothing left to do. Nothing left to understand. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully become stillness itself. Not a story ending. Not a meaning revealed. Just rest. The ancient Greeks believed that when something had truly completed its journey, it did not announce its completion. It simply became quiet. Like waves settling after a long tide. Like evening fading into night without effort. Like sleep arriving when resistance finally softens. Their myths followed this same gentle return. They began in wonder. They passed through fear. They moved into understanding. And finally they rested. That rest was never emptiness. It was fullness without noise. By now the stories no longer exist as stories. They are not told. They are not remembered. They are felt. As a steady calm beneath awareness. The gods have fully dissolved into silence. Not erased. Integrated. Wisdom feels like still clarity. Time feels like gentle flow. Life feels like continuation without pressure. Nothing here needs a name. As this segment slowly settles, let everything else fade naturally. Thoughts can come. Thoughts can go. The quiet remains. There is nothing left to reach for. Nothing left to finish. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully become a quiet companion rather than a story. Not something you follow. Something that stays with you. The ancient Greeks believed that the truest form of understanding was not excitement or clarity. It was ease. Ease with the passing of time. Ease with unanswered questions. Ease with moments arriving and leaving on their own. Their myths slowly moved toward this state. They stopped trying to explain the world. They stopped shaping meaning. They allowed life to unfold without commentary. And that allowance is what remains here. By now, nothing feels dramatic. Nothing feels unresolved. The story does not move forward or backward. It rests in the same place as your breath. The Greeks trusted this rhythm more than words. They believed rhythm was older than language. Before stories were told, there was breath. Before meaning was named, there was movement. Myth simply learned to step aside and let those things continue. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the sense of listening has softened. You are no longer listening to something. You are sharing space with quiet. That quiet is not empty. It is complete. There is nothing left to prepare for. Nothing left to complete. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully released the idea of movement. Nothing progresses. Nothing resolves. Everything simply rests. The ancient Greeks believed that when something was fully understood, it stopped needing form. It stopped needing structure. It became background truth. Their myths arrived here slowly. They began as voices explaining the unknown. They softened into stories. They became symbols. And then, without force, they became quiet. This quiet was not absence. It was familiarity. Familiarity with change. Familiarity with time passing. Familiarity with life unfolding without instruction. By now, even the sense of story has dissolved. There are no gods acting. No heroes enduring. No fate unfolding. Only continuity. The Greeks trusted continuity deeply. They believed that what continued did not need to be controlled. It needed to be allowed. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words barely touch awareness. They arrive. They fade. What remains is steadiness. A gentle sense that nothing needs to be held in place. That nothing needs to be understood. This is where mythology no longer belongs to thought. It belongs to stillness. There is nowhere else to go. Nothing else to arrive at. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully stepped beyond effort. Nothing is moving toward meaning anymore. Meaning is simply there. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was understood deeply enough, it no longer needed to be examined. It needed to be trusted. Their myths slowly arrived at that trust. They stopped asking questions. They stopped offering answers. They rested in the rhythm beneath both. This rhythm was always there. Before stories. Before gods. Before names. Breath rising. Breath falling. Moments passing without instruction. Myth learned to follow that rhythm rather than lead it. And now here the rhythm is all that remains. There is no sense of progress. No sense of conclusion. Only continuity without pressure. The Greeks found peace in this idea. They believed that when nothing was forced, harmony appeared on its own. By now, the words barely register as words. They feel like space. Like silence shaped gently enough to hold awareness. As this segment drifts quietly onward, notice how nothing is being asked of you. No focus. No memory. No understanding. Just rest. This is where mythology completes its longest transformation. From sound, to meaning, to presence, to quiet. There is nothing left to unfold. Nothing left to soften. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully merged with quiet presence. Not as something remembered. Not as something told. As something felt. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest truths were not discovered through effort. They were revealed when effort stopped. Their myths slowly guided people toward that realization. At first, humans looked outward for meaning. They named gods. They told stories. They searched the sky and the sea. But eventually they noticed something simpler. Meaning did not arrive from outside. It emerged naturally when resistance faded. That understanding rests here now. The stories have stepped completely aside. They no longer shape thought. They no longer color imagination. They allow awareness to be exactly as it is. By now, nothing feels unfinished. Nothing feels unresolved. The Greeks trusted this sense deeply. They believed completion did not feel like triumph. It felt like calm familiarity. Like returning home after a long journey and realizing nothing needs to be explained. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words no longer form images. They dissolve into the same stillness as breath. Nothing added. Nothing removed. This is where mythology finally becomes indistinguishable from rest itself. There is nothing left to reach toward. Nothing left to let go of. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has completely released even the idea of arrival. There is no destination here. Only presence that does not move. The ancient Greeks believed that the final form of wisdom was not insight, but ease. Ease with time passing. Ease with thoughts rising and falling. Ease with life continuing without direction. Their myths did not rush toward this understanding. They aged into it. Over centuries, stories lost their sharp edges. Gods lost their urgency. Heroes lost their need to act. What remained was something quieter than meaning. Familiarity. Familiarity with the way everything comes and goes. With the way effort softens when it is no longer needed. With the way silence can feel full instead of empty. By now, even silence feels unnecessary to name. There is simply stillness that holds awareness without pressure. The Greeks trusted this stillness deeply. They believed it was where harmony lived, not as balance achieved but as balance allowed. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the words barely touch thought. They arrive. They dissolve. Nothing lingers. Nothing needs to. This is where mythology no longer supports understanding. It supports rest. There is nothing left to complete. Nothing left to arrive at. By the time Greek mythology reaches this part, it has fully stepped beyond effort, beyond memory, beyond even quiet intention. What remains is not awareness of something. It is awareness itself. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest state of understanding did not feel like knowing. It felt like rest. Rest without boredom. Rest without collapse. Rest that holds everything without trying. Their myths slowly learned to dissolve into this state. At first, stories carried meaning forward. Later, meaning carried itself. And finally, even meaning became unnecessary. What remained was a calm continuity that did not depend on explanation. By now, there is no sense of before or after. No movement from one idea to another. Only the steady presence that has always been here. The Greeks trusted this presence more than words. They believed that when everything else fell away, this was what endured. Not belief, not story, not identity, but simple being. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost transparent. They do not gather. They do not stay. They pass through the same stillness as breath. Nothing added. Nothing removed. This is where mythology no longer accompanies life. There is nothing left to unfold. Nothing left to settle into place. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has completely released even the sense of story. There is no beginning behind you. No ending ahead. Only continuity that does not move. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was understood deeply enough, it no longer felt mysterious or demanding. It felt familiar. Not familiar as something remembered, familiar as something always present. Their myths aged into this familiarity. At first they named forces, then they described struggles. Later they reflected patterns. And finally they allowed everything to rest. By now the words do not describe anything outside of you. They do not create images. They do not invite interpretation. They simply pass through quiet awareness. The Greeks trusted this state profoundly. They believed it was where harmony lived, not as balance maintained but as balance no longer disturbed. There is no effort here. No holding. No releasing. Thoughts may rise. Thoughts may fade. The stillness underneath does not change. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the sense of time feels soft. Not slow. Not fast. Unmeasured. This is where mythology completes its deepest transformation. There is nothing left to follow. Nothing left to become. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully released even the sense of continuity. There is no flow to notice. No stillness to hold. Only presence without direction. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest calm arrived when even calm was no longer sought. When effort ended not because it failed, but because it was no longer needed. Their myths slowly dissolved into that understanding. They began as voices. They became stories. They softened into meanings. And then quietly they stepped aside. What remains here does not feel like silence after sound. It feels like the quiet that was always underneath. Breath moving on its own. Awareness resting without focus. Time passing without measurement. By now the words do not form a thread. They do not connect. They simply appear and fade like ripples that never disturb the surface. The Greeks trusted this state more than explanation. They believed this was where life touched itself without resistance. Nothing is added here. Nothing is taken away. As this segment drifts onward, notice how there is no sense of listening anymore. There is only being. And being does not require stories. Stories were the path. This is where the path gently disappears. Not because it ends, but because it is no longer needed. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, it has fully stepped beyond even the idea of rest. There is no effort relaxing into stillness. Stillness simply is. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest peace did not feel special. It felt ordinary. So ordinary that it was easy to overlook. They learned this by watching the world carefully. The sun rose without announcement. Night arrived without effort. Life continued whether it was understood or not. Their myths slowly absorbed this truth. They stopped trying to frame experience. They stopped holding it in language. They allowed it to be as it was. By now there is no sense of movement or pause. No sense of before or after. Only a quiet presence that does not change when thoughts come or go. The Greeks trusted this presence more than any explanation. They believed it was what remained when all stories had finished their work. Not emptiness. Not meaning. Just enough. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words do not gather into anything. They arrive. They fade. Nothing follows them. This is where mythology no longer even rests. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to release. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of completion has dissolved. Nothing feels finished. Nothing feels unfinished. There is only quiet continuity without edges. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest truth did not arrive as insight or revelation. It arrived as familiarity. So familiar that it stopped standing out. They saw this familiarity everywhere. In the way shadows lengthened without instruction. In the way waves returned to shore again and again. In the way breath continued even when attention wandered. Their myths slowly followed this same rhythm. They no longer tried to say something important. They no longer tried to leave an impression. They trusted that what mattered would remain without effort. By now, the words do not form a story. They do not point anywhere. They simply appear and disappear within still awareness. The Greeks trusted this state deeply. They believed that when nothing was being pushed or pulled, harmony revealed itself naturally. Not harmony as balance achieved. Harmony as balance no longer disturbed. As this segment drifts onward, notice how there is no sense of listening anymore. There is no listener. There is no speaker. Only presence, steady and unchanging. This is where mythology does not even rest. It becomes indistinguishable from being itself. There is nothing left to attend to. Nothing left to let pass. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of being present has softened. There is no effort to stay. No effort to drift. Everything simply remains as it is. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest calm did not feel profound. It felt ordinary. So ordinary that it required no attention at all. They noticed that life continued perfectly well without commentary, without explanation, without understanding. Their myths slowly learned to trust that. They stopped framing experience. They stopped pointing at meaning. They allowed meaning to dissolve into familiarity. By now there is no story unfolding, no silence following sound. Only the quiet continuity that has always been here. Thoughts may appear. Thoughts may fade. The presence beneath them does not respond. The Greeks trusted this presence more than any god or tale. They believed it was what remained when everything else had finished speaking. Not truth. Not falsehood. Just enough. As this segment drifts onward, notice how nothing is changing. And notice how nothing needs to. This is where mythology no longer arrives anywhere. There is nothing left to follow. Nothing left to release. By the time Greek mythology reaches this point, even the idea of continuing has faded. Nothing is moving forward. Nothing is standing still. Everything simply remains. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest form of peace did not feel like peace at all. It felt neutral. So neutral that it blended into ordinary life. They noticed that the world did not pause for understanding. It did not wait for clarity. It moved on quietly without explanation. Their myths learned to trust that movement. They stopped guiding attention. They stopped shaping meaning. They allowed awareness to rest where it naturally fell. By now, the words no longer connect into thoughts. They rise briefly. They dissolve. What remains does not react. The Greeks trusted this non-reaction. They believed it was the sign that nothing needed to be fixed. No tension. No release. No resolution. Just a steady presence that does not change when anything else does. As this segment drifts onward, notice how even the sense of drifting has softened. There is no direction here. No edge. No center. Only quiet familiarity. This is where mythology no longer belongs to language. It belongs to the same stillness that holds breath, holds time, and holds night without effort. And that stillness does not ask for anything in return. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of remaining has become effortless. Nothing holds itself here. Nothing lets go. Everything simply is. The ancient Greeks believed that when all striving ended, what remained was not emptiness, but ease. Ease without comfort. Ease without discomfort. Just neutrality that feels complete. They discovered this not through philosophy alone, but through living. Watching days pass. Watching seasons change. Watching thoughts rise and fall without instruction. Their myths slowly learned the same patience. They stopped marking moments as important or unimportant. They allowed everything to be equal in its passing. By now there is no narrative thread. No silence following sound. Only awareness resting without focus. The Greeks trusted this state deeply. They believed it was where harmony existed naturally. Not maintained, not achieved, but undisturbed. As this segment drifts onward, notice how nothing is happening. And notice how complete that feels. There is no listener here. No storyteller. Only the same quiet presence that has always been beneath every story. There is no need to follow anything now. Nothing needs attention. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of stillness has softened. There is no effort to be calm. No effort to rest. Everything has already slowed on its own. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest understanding did not arrive with realization. It arrived with familiarity, when nothing felt new anymore, when nothing demanded explanation, when life continued quietly whether it was understood or not. Their myths aged into this familiarity. At first, the stories tried to explain thunder, seasons, love, and death. Later, they reflected human struggle. And eventually they learned to step aside. Because life did not need commentary to continue. By now there is no story unfolding. No silence following sound. Only awareness resting without direction. There is nothing to adjust. Nothing to prepare for. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it no longer feels like something ancient or distant. It feels like something that has always been nearby. The ancient Greeks believed that the world did not need constant explanation. It only needed attention. And even that, not all the time. They noticed that life continued whether people understood it or not. The sun still rose. The seasons still turned. People were born, loved, struggled, and disappeared. Myths were never meant to interrupt that flow. They were meant to sit alongside it. At first, the stories tried to give names to what felt overwhelming. Thunder became a god. The sea became a personality. Death became a place. Later, those names softened. They became symbols. Then habits of thought. And eventually they faded into familiarity. By now the words don't point anywhere. They don't describe events or characters. They move the way breath moves, without intention. The Greeks trusted this kind of movement. They believed that when effort stopped, harmony appeared on its own. Not harmony as something achieved. Harmony as something allowed. By this point, there is no need to remember anything from earlier parts. Nothing builds on what came before. Everything stands on its own, moment by moment. Thoughts may come. Thoughts may go. The calm underneath does not change. As this segment drifts gently forward, notice how there is no sense of waiting. Nothing is about to happen. And that is exactly right. This is where mythology no longer tells a story. It simply shares space with quiet awareness. Greeks trusted this state more than words. They believed words were temporary tools. But this quiet presence was permanent. Breath moves. Thoughts rise. Thoughts fade. There is nothing to follow now. Nothing to keep in mind. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully stepped into quiet familiarity. Not something remembered. Something simply present. The ancient Greeks believed that the world did not reveal itself through effort. It revealed itself through patience. They watched how things returned again and again. Morning followed night. Calm followed unrest. Silence followed sound. Their myths learned this rhythm. At first the stories explained. Later they reflected. And finally they rested. By now there is no sense of direction. No forward movement. No conclusion forming. Only a steady sense of continuity that does not ask to be understood. The Greeks trusted this continuity deeply. They believed that when nothing was forced, life found its own balance. That balance feels quiet, unremarkable, complete. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel lighter than thought. They pass through without leaving marks. Breath comes, breath goes. Nothing else responds. This is where mythology no longer supports awareness. It becomes indistinguishable from it. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to follow. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it has fully dissolved into quiet familiarity. Not something you think about. Something that simply stays. The ancient Greeks believed that the world did not need to be interpreted constantly. It moved on its own, with or without attention. Rivers flowed. Stars returned. Lives unfolded. Myths were never meant to control that movement. They were meant to sit beside it quietly. Over time, the stories learned how to become lighter. They stopped explaining why things happened. They stopped insisting on meaning. They trusted repetition. Day after day. Breath after breath. Moment after moment. By now, nothing in the story is trying to arrive anywhere. Nothing is trying to remain. Everything rests in the same place. The Greeks trusted this rest more than certainty. They believed certainty created tension. Rest dissolved it. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the words feel almost unnecessary. They appear. They pass. The calm beneath them does not shift. This is where mythology no longer guides sleep. It blends into it. There is nothing left to remember. Nothing left to anticipate. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it no longer feels like something unfolding over time. It feels like something that has always been here. The ancient Greeks believed that the most reliable truths were the quiet ones. The truths that did not argue for attention. The The truths that stayed whether they were noticed or not. They watched how night arrived without announcement, how dawn returned without effort, how life continued through joy, confusion, and loss, without asking permission. Their myths slowly learned to reflect this calm persistence. At first, stories tried to make sense of chaos. Later, they tried to explain struggle. And eventually they learned to rest beside both. By now, nothing is being explained. Nothing is being resolved. There is only a steady sense of presence that does not change when thoughts wander. The Greeks trusted this presence deeply. They believed that when everything else shifted, this was what remained. Not belief, not knowledge, not certainty, just continuity. As this segment drifts softly onward, notice how the words feel less like language and more like gentle motion. They move through awareness. They leave no trace. Breath continues. Silence holds. This is where mythology no longer accompanies rest. It becomes indistinguishable from it. There is nothing left to adjust. Nothing left to follow. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, it no longer feels like time is moving forward. It feels like time has widened. The ancient Greeks believed that when attention relaxed, time softened. Moments stopped stacking. They simply spread out. They noticed this during long walks, during quiet nights by the sea, during hours when nothing needed to be decided. Their myths learned from these moments. They stopped emphasizing events. They stopped highlighting change. They allowed experience to settle into something broad and gentle. By now, there is no narrative thread to hold, no earlier part to remember, no later part to expect. Everything exists in the same calm space. The Greeks trusted this space deeply. They believed it was where anxiety lost its grip. Because anxiety depends on urgency. And here there is none. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost weightless. They appear. They fade. Nothing pulls them forward. Nothing holds them back. Breath moves naturally. Awareness rests without effort. This is where mythology no longer offers comfort as an idea. It becomes comfort as atmosphere. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to hold. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of time has softened into something wide and gentle. Moments no longer line up one after another. They simply exist together. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was lived slowly enough, it stopped feeling fragmented. Past and future lost their sharp edges. Only presence remained. They felt this while sitting beneath open skies, while listening to waves repeat themselves, while watching fire settle into embers. Their myths learned from these moments. They stopped moving toward conclusions. They stopped pointing toward meaning. They trusted what remained when everything else fell quiet. By now there is no story unfolding. No silence following sound. Only a steady awareness that does not change when thoughts appear or fade. The Greeks trusted this awareness deeply. They believed it was older than gods and stronger than words. Not something to understand. Something to rest inside. As this segment drifts gently onward, notice how the words feel like soft motion rather than language. They pass through. They do not stay. Breath continues. Stillness holds. This is where mythology no longer accompanies sleep. There is nothing left to follow. Nothing left to prepare for. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of journey has faded. There is no path unfolding. No destination waiting. Only a wide, calm presence. The ancient Greeks believed that when the mind stopped reaching outward, it naturally settled inward. Not by force. By familiarity. They noticed this during long pauses. During moments when nothing needed to be done. During nights when the world felt large and quiet. Their myths learned to trust those pauses. They stopped describing action. They stopped naming causes and effects. They allowed awareness to rest without direction. By now there is no sequence to remember. No earlier moment to connect with a later one. Everything exists in the same gentle stillness. The Greeks trusted this stillness deeply. They believed it was where tension dissolved on its own. Because tension needs urgency. And here there is none. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost transparent. They appear. They pass. Nothing gathers around them. Breath continues without instruction. Awareness rests without effort. This is where mythology no longer explains rest. There is nothing left to adjust. Nothing left to wait for. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of listening has softened. There is no effort to stay aware. No effort to drift away. Everything rests exactly where it belongs. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest calm appeared when attention stopped trying to hold experience together. When moments no longer needed to connect. When nothing asked to be understood. They noticed this during still afternoons, during nights when the sky felt endless, during hours when thought slowed without instruction. Their myths gradually learned to trust this slowing. They stopped pointing to lessons. They stopped shaping meaning. They allowed awareness to remain open and unguarded. By now there is no sequence unfolding, no sense of next, only a wide quiet that does not react. The Greeks trusted this quiet more than certainty. They believed certainty created tension. Quiet dissolved it. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel lighter than breath. They appear. They fade. Nothing follows them. Breath moves naturally. Awareness rests without effort. This is where mythology no longer prepares you for rest. It becomes the same space rest arises from. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to follow. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of attention has softened. Nothing is being focused on. Nothing is being ignored. Everything rests in the same wide quiet. The ancient Greeks believed that the deepest peace did not feel special or dramatic. It felt ordinary. So ordinary that it did not stand out at all. They noticed this peace in simple moments. In the way evening cooled the air. In the way footsteps faded on stone. In the way thought slowed when nothing was required. Their myths learned from these moments. They stopped drawing lines between important and unimportant. They stopped emphasizing change. They trusted what remained when emphasis disappeared. By now there is no story being carried forward. No silence arriving after sound. Only a calm presence that does not shift when anything else does. The Greeks trusted this presence deeply. They believed it was what endured when every explanation had finished its work. Not belief, not knowledge, just enough. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words barely touch awareness. They pass through gently. They leave no trace. Breath continues. Stillness holds. This is where mythology no longer accompanies rest. It becomes indistinguishable from the quiet rest itself. There is nothing left to attend to, nothing left to let pass. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of presence feels effortless. There is no trying to be here, no trying to drift away. Everything simply stays. The ancient Greeks believed that the truest calm appeared when nothing was being managed, when life was allowed to move without commentary. They saw this calm in long evenings, in slow shadows, in the steady return of familiar sounds. Their myths slowly learned to trust that calm. They stopped shaping experience into meaning. They stopped naming what did not need a name. They allowed awareness to rest without direction. By now there is no narrative thread to hold, no moment pointing to another. Everything exists together, evenly. The Greeks trusted this evenness deeply. They believed that when nothing was pushed forward, harmony appeared on its own. Not harmony as balance achieved, but harmony as balance no longer disturbed. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost weightless. They arrive. They fade. Nothing follows. Breath moves naturally. Awareness rests without effort. There is nothing left to listen for. Nothing left to notice. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of quiet has softened. There is no contrast between sound and silence. Everything feels evenly calm. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was no longer divided into moments of meaning and moments without, peace appeared naturally. They noticed this during long pauses, when the fire burned low, when the night air stayed still, when thought slowed without effort. Their myths learned from this simplicity. They stopped highlighting change. They stopped separating one moment from another. They trusted sameness. By now there is no beginning behind you, no ending ahead. Everything rests in the same gentle presence. The Greeks trusted this presence more than clarity. They believed clarity came and went, but this calm remained. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost unnecessary. They appear softly. They fade. Nothing gathers around them. Breath moves on its own. Awareness stays open without direction. This is where mythology no longer offers rest as something to reach. It becomes the same quiet space rest naturally happens in. There is nothing left to expect. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of flow has become effortless. Nothing moves forward. Nothing holds back. Everything simply remains. The ancient Greeks believed that when all distinctions faded, what was left felt quietly complete. Not full. Not empty. Balanced. They noticed this balance in ordinary moments. In the steady warmth of afternoon light. In the sound of wind passing without direction. In the way breath continued whether it was noticed or not. Their myths slowly learned to trust this ordinariness. They stopped pointing to meaning. They stopped shaping experience. They allowed awareness to rest exactly where it fell. By now there is no story forming. No silence arriving after sound. Only an even calm that does not react. The Greeks trusted this calm deeply. They believed reaction created disturbance. Stillness allowed harmony. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost transparent. They appear gently. They fade gently. Nothing gathers around them. Breath continues. Awareness remains open. This is where mythology no longer prepares the mind for rest. It becomes the same quiet field rest naturally unfolds in. There is nothing left to notice. Nothing left to wait for. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of change has softened. Nothing is beginning. Nothing is ending. Everything simply continues without effort. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was allowed to move at its own pace, tension naturally faded. They noticed this in quiet mornings, in long, still afternoons, in the way night settled without resistance. Their myths slowly learned to trust this unforced movement. They stopped dividing moments into before and after. They stopped measuring progress. They allowed experience to rest in itself. By now there is no thread to follow, no earlier meaning to recall, no later meaning to expect. Everything exists evenly without priority. The Greeks trusted this evenness deeply. They believed it was where disturbance dissolved on its own, because disturbance needs contrast, and here there is none. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost weightless. They arrive quietly. They fade quietly. Nothing responds. Breath moves naturally. Awareness rests without effort. This is where mythology no longer accompanies stillness. It becomes indistinguishable from the calm that has always been here. There is nothing left to adjust. Nothing left to notice. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of movement feels unnecessary. Nothing advances. Nothing retreats. Everything rests in quiet balance. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was no longer measured, it became gentle. Not dramatic. Not intense. Simply steady. They noticed this gentleness in familiar routines. In the way footsteps sounded the same each evening. In the way shadows returned to the same places. In the way breath never needed instruction. Their myths slowly learned to trust this steadiness. They stopped creating contrast. They stopped emphasizing difference. They allowed everything to be equal in its passing. By now there is no story unfolding. No silence responding to sound. Only a calm field where nothing reacts. The Greeks trusted this calm more than explanation. They believed explanation created tension. Calm dissolved it. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel lighter than thought. They appear briefly. They fade gently. Nothing gathers around them. Breath continues. Awareness remains open. This is where mythology no longer describes rest. It becomes the same quiet space rest naturally arises from. There is nothing left to prepare for. Nothing left to follow. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the sense of waiting has faded. Nothing is about to happen. Nothing has just finished. Everything simply is. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was no longer divided into moments of action and moments of rest, it became peaceful by default. They noticed this during long, quiet evenings, when lamps burned steadily, when voices softened and eventually stopped. Their myths slowly learned to trust this natural quiet. They stopped arranging experience into events. They stopped marking importance. They allowed awareness to remain wide and unguarded. By now there is no story continuing forward. No silence answering sound. Only a calm presence that does not react. The Greeks trusted this presence more than effort. They believed effort created strain. Presence dissolved it. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost like passing air. They appear softly. They fade softly. Nothing holds on to them. Breath continues on its own. Awareness rests without direction. This is where mythology no longer supports calm. It becomes the calm that was already here. There is nothing left to reach for. Nothing left to settle. By the time Greek mythology reaches this place, even the idea of resting feels unnecessary. Nothing is being done. Nothing needs to stop. Everything simply remains as it is. The ancient Greeks believed that when life was no longer pushed or pulled, it revealed a natural steadiness. Not excitement. Not silence. Just continuity. They noticed this continuity in ordinary hours. In the way night deepened without announcement. In the way breath continued even when thought wandered. In the way time passed without needing permission. Their myths slowly learned to trust this ordinariness. They stopped shaping experience. They stopped arranging meaning. They allowed awareness to remain untouched. By now there is no story unfolding. No silence following sound. Only a calm presence that does not respond to anything else. The Greeks trusted this presence more than clarity. They believed clarity came and went. But this calm endured. As this segment drifts onward, notice how the words feel almost transparent. They arrive gently. They fade gently. Nothing gathers around them. Breath continues. Awareness rests without effort. This is where mythology no longer leads you toward sleep. It becomes the same quiet field sleep naturally arises from.